There were few witnesses to the accident, but they all unanimously decided that the child needed to be taken to the hospital first, and that the girl was simply tired of living. Margot didn't expect gratitude for saving the child, but the fact that she was left to die in the roadway just because she looked unpresentable was too much. The girl is unemployed, and no one saw any nobility in her actions. They considered it an attempt to commit suicide, especially since the issue of paying for treatment arose. Margot, on the brink of oblivion, sighed heavily, wondering why she was always treated like this, as if she were defective and did not deserve attention and care, when all she wanted was love. Margarita opened her eyes. Someone politely called her princess and announced that dinner was served. The girl didn't realize where she had ended up. Everything around her was so bright and sparkling that it was difficult to open her eyes. The most amazing thing was that the girl felt a crown on her head. It felt like it was gold and was attached to her hair with carefully pinned hairpins. Margot felt like a real princess in a charming dress, crown, hairdo, manicure, makeup, and everything that goes with it. The caring voice of a smiling maid announced that a special treat had been prepared for Her Highness, her favorite sweet buns. The girl sat down at a table beautifully set for breakfast, with a hot coffee pot and a dozen different types of dessert, and thanked the maid for her care. Has Margot's dream really come true, and she has finally found a caring and loving family where happiness, peace, and joy await her? Margot reached for the bun with her fork, ready to bite into its rosy side. But the bun began to shake and turned into something strange. The bun developed eyes, a mouth, and a nasty mustache, and in a nasty, rude voice, the bun declared to Margot that whoever doesn't work doesn't eat. The werewolf bun pulled a broom, mop, and rag out of thin air and declared that Margot was a lazy person and that if she wanted to eat, she should clean first. The girl objected. She was a princess and needed to be pampered and cherished, but the bun declared that Margot should first wipe the dust and then scrub the floors everywhere. The nasty bun only became angry at the girl's timid objections and declared that Margot should move faster, otherwise she wouldn't get a stale crust. The girl got angry and fell out of bed. It was only a dream, but look how much it resembled her real life. The bun was exactly like her owner. What upset Margot most was that the nasty bun in her dream had overturned the table, and so much delicious food had been wasted. Margot found herself 2 years ago in the world of a romantic fantasy book, the contents of which she barely remembered. An orphan again, now 9 years old. The morning of the new day did not promise anything, but the girl did not know that a brilliant aristocrat had arrived for her soul in the hole where she worked for food and shelter. Margosha noticed that the owner was polite and obsequious to the visitor, but she could not understand what such a high-born nobleman was doing in this hole. The girl knew perfectly well that the aristocrats did not care about the common people. This was the Empire of Barbados, and there was a huge gap between the rich and the poor. Margot immediately forgot about the visitor. There were too many things to do, several rooms still to clean, and then laundry and helping in the kitchen. What kind of nobles were they? The girl was outraged that she worked 15 hours a day for her master, the mustachioed bun, but should be grateful to him for food and shelter. Remember the ray, here is the sun. And the mustachioed bun, as soon as Margot thought about him, he appeared behind her and declared his traditional, "He who does not work, neither eats." The girl was indignant. She had worked hard. The room was almost cleaned, and he brought dirt from the street on his boots, and she had to wash it again. The owner declared that he would punish Margot for her insolence later. A nobleman had come to visit her, and she should appreciate it. Margot looked around, and right in front of her stood a simply incredible man. Only a blind person could have mistaken him for a commoner. The girl was amazed by the man's beauty and stateliness, but she had never met him before. The man looked closely at Margot and declared that a DNA test was not needed here. The similarity was visible to the naked eye. The nobleman exclaimed something like, "Finally, I have found you, my daughter," and introduced himself. It was Count Bernard Ruby de Hart. His family owned the western lands of the empire. Margot remembered that she woke up in the western lands, starving and wandering. She tried to find her relatives, but to no avail. Count Bernard asked the girl what her name was, and she replied that her first name was Margarita, but she didn't know her last name because she was an orphan and didn't remember her parents. Margot wondered why his lordship decided that she was his lost daughter, how he recognized her. The count explained that he had a portrait of his daughter. It was painted immediately after her birth. She was tiny and lovely, and now the girl had grown up. Margot expected the Count to say that she had become prettier and was generally incredibly sweet. Only the man remained thoughtfully silent and looked Margot over from head to toe with a searching gaze. Bernard stated that he had doubts about the portrait, but now he sees that his blood flows in it and announced that he intends to take the girl. The owner was only glad. Margot's opinion didn't interest anyone, and after some time, she was already sitting in a carriage opposite the Count and traveling in an unknown direction. Margarita was interested in the question of why the Count had come for her only now. Bernard explained that he simply could not find her. The fact is that just a couple of days ago, Bernard Ruby had no idea that he had a daughter. Bernard convinced Margot that it was difficult to find information about her. He had only recently learned that she was alive and had immediately rushed after her. Margot wanted to believe it, but the Count never looked her in the eye while he was saying all this. No respect for his interlocutor, or simply an obvious lie. Margarita thought. It turned out that her existence was hidden from the Count, so he could not find her, in which case she should be grateful to Bernard. Only Margot knew the customs of the Barbados Empire. There was no room for sentimentality, and everything had to be paid for. The girl said that she had learned the official version well and would tell it to everyone. But now she wanted to hear what really happened. The Count was amazed at the girl's intelligence and asked how she realized that he was lying. Margot replied that she did not believe in miracles, and the Count, upon seeing his supposedly more ardent, beloved daughter, did not shed a tear. Bernard doesn't care whether Margot is his biological child or not, so he didn't bother with a DNA test. For some reason, he needs a girl whom he can pass off as his daughter. The Count was satisfied that the girl was not stupid and offered her a deal that would be beneficial to both of them. The point was that a few days ago, the Count's 8-year-old son had died in an accident. Bernard warned that no matter how compassionate Margot looked at him, he mostly didn't care about the boy. The girl assumed that deep down the Count was hurt, but Bernard replied indifferently that he was not at all upset. He could easily find a new one. His age allowed it. Margot was indignant. The Count was surprisingly calm for a man who had lost a child and did not at all look like a grieving father. Bernard chuckled. Margot speaks exactly as his father, the head of the Hart family, stated. Since Bernard does not have a drop of humanity, he is unworthy of being his successor. Bernard's father believed that a man who did not care about his son's death should not be allowed to rule over others. He would never become a worthy ruler. While talking, Count Bernard and Margot arrived at the de Hart mansion. It was time to get out of the carriage. Bernard explained that his father had set a condition. He had to find his illegitimate daughter. Such a one actually existed somewhere, but he had no time to search for her. If Bernard finds the girl and takes care of her, then he will most likely be able to find at least a drop of humanity, and then the title of heir will be returned to him. Margosha understood why the Count needed her, and the desire to have a daughter had nothing to do with it. Bernard declared that he could never have been inflamed with a fatherly love for the first slut he met, and Margot had hoped for this in vain. On the other hand, Bernard guaranteed Margot a comfortable and trouble-free life in the de Hart mansion. All she had to do was pretend to be his daughter. Margarita had to pretend to be a loving family in exchange for food and shelter. It was unpleasant, but better than doing hard work and going hungry for the same thing. Count Bernard admitted that he was ready to pay a tidy sum for Margot, but the owner of the flophouse made it easy for him and gave the girl away for free. Margot became wary, since Bernard was ready to buy the family with money. Then as soon as she became useless, he could easily get rid of the unwanted daughter. By and large, the girl didn't care. She was tired of living in a dirty closet and eating scraps. She was being given a chance to start life with a clean slate, and she wouldn't let it slip away. Margot agreed to Bernard's proposal and promised to do everything to help him achieve what he wanted. The girl hoped that by making the de Hart family take her into account, she would find a life full of happiness and true love. The de Hart family's mansion was striking in its luxurious decoration and furnishings. Even the chandeliers were decorated with diamonds, a rarity in the empire. This family was much richer and more influential than Margarita could have imagined. Servants lined up on both sides of the hallway. They had been warned of the new mistress's arrival. The girl saw no difference in their beautiful and smiling faces. Margot expected a lot, but reality surpassed all her fantasies. Unbelievably, even the servants were chosen with outstanding appearance. Bernard stated that his office was on the 3rd floor, the far door on the right, and expressed hope that Margot would be able to find it without difficulty. Count Bernard entrusted the care of the girl and her appearance to two servant girls and ordered that Margot be brought into proper appearance for dinner. The maids didn't show any concern and promised to complete the task on time. Bernard ordered Margot to come to the dining room at exactly 6 o'clock in the evening, since it was customary in the family to dine together, and at the same time, he would introduce her to all the relatives. Margosha put on a captivating smile. She pretended that she was happy with everything and would do everything. Inside the girl, everything was screaming with indignation. Was she really so dirty that she needed to go wash herself right away? The behavior of the new father infuriated Margot. Although she was ready to admit that his orders made sense, the girl definitely did not smell like flowers. The maids decided that it would be difficult for them to cope in such a short time, so Margot had to follow a whole group of girls. Based on her limited but complex life experience, Margarita divided the inhabitants of Barbados into two types. The first type consisted of people who were indifferent, cold, and rude to others, like Margot's former owner. The second type consisted of people capable of ostentatious kindness for the sake of their own self-interest. The girl classified all the local servants as such people. Margot decided that she had to keep a straight face and not let her guard down for a second. Although Margot may be considered the daughter of DeHart's eldest son, in fact, she is a commoner, and sooner or later they would start to persecute her. But she could not back down. The girl decided to prove to everyone at any cost that she was a true DeHart, no matter what it cost her. The procession arrived at Margot's room, and one of the maids asked if the mistress would like to spend a little time talking with them. Margot nodded. She didn't expect that after this, the girls would rush to her with hugs and call her cutie and charming. The maids decided that the girl was so pretty because she was the daughter of Count Bernard. With such a lovely face, this child could only be of noble birth. The maids dragged Margarita into the bathroom. They promised to make the girl the most beautiful in the world. The girls had to do a huge job of transforming the slob into the Count's daughter, and all the free servants came to help. Choosing a dress took a long time. Margot tried on at least a dozen before the maids found the one that, in their opinion, best suited her complexion. Then they chose the decorations. Margot didn't even have time to react to everything. All she could do was go with the flow and wait for the result. Having finished their work, the girls asked Lady Margaret to look at herself in the mirror. Margot shuddered. Even the mirrors in the mansion were gigantic. But what she saw in the magic glass brought her into indescribable delight. Margarita always considered herself quite cute, but in this outfit, she looked like a completely different person. The girl liked everything incredibly. The maids said that the elder master only ordered them to help her bathe and change clothes. But the lady was so sweet that they became engrossed in transforming her appearance. Margot clarified, which means there is a younger gentleman in the family. One of the girls confirmed her words. The DeHart brothers are handsome and smart. The girl bowed and introduced herself as Beatrice, the head maid, and if the lady needed anything, she could contact her at any time. Bertisa announced that the servants had prepared a small surprise for Lady Margaret and handed her a raspberry lollipop. Margot had hardly seen any sweets like this one. The girls said they didn't know what the lady liked, so they chose the most popular sweet. The kindness of the servants alarmed Margot. It was strange that people who barely knew her decided to spend money to make the girl's life sweeter and more fun. Beatrice understood the girl's wariness. Judging by the appearance in which the young lady arrived at the mansion, her life had not been easy. The head maid smiled and asked the young lady not to refuse the gift. It was given with a pure heart. At first, Margarita was categorically against it. She decided not to get attached to anyone here and to be on guard all the time. After thinking, she thanked Beatrice and accepted the lollipop. It was only her first day here. There was no point in ruining her relationship with the servants. Margot's actions caused an explosion of emotions in the head maid, and a new wave of hugs fell upon the girl. Margarita decided that today, she would simply go with the flow, and later she would decide how to treat whom here. Margot practically ran down the long corridor of the mansion. She couldn't be late for dinner. Her first meeting with her family was coming up. The corridor did not end. To her regret, Margarita forgot to specify where the dining room was. Margot was late because after swimming and having a light snack, she fell asleep. Now she felt full of strength and energy, but she was late for dinner. A human figure loomed in the distance of the corridor. It was clearly a male child. Margarita shouted after the guy that he should wait for her and not rush to leave. It seemed that the boy did not hear Margot. Although this was impossible, she was screaming loudly enough. Margarita got angry. She almost caught up with the guy and wanted to demand an answer for his rude behavior. The girl didn't have time to say anything. The boy clearly didn't want to make contact. The guy suddenly took off, and Margarita was again left far behind, which infuriated and surprised the girl. Margot decided that if she let him go, she wouldn't be able to meet anyone else and would definitely be late for dinner. The girl ran and finally managed to catch up with the strange boy. She needed to find out where the dining room was. Margot grabbed the guy by the jacket and he stopped. The girl asked him for forgiveness and justified herself by saying that he was her last hope. Margarita, without letting go of the boy's jacket, asked him to show her the way to the dining room. At that moment, she took in his appearance: jet black hair, scarlet eyes, snow-white skin. Standing before her was none other than the son of the younger gentleman, the future Count Ethan. The de Hart estate belongs to Lord Salvador. His sons live with him, the eldest, Bernard, and the youngest, Edward. The youngest has a wife and 2 children. The eldest is Ethan. Ethan, the future genius swordsman and a handsome man, now stood Margot next to his younger self, and she urgently needed to establish a relationship with him. Ethan was indignant. Judging by her unceremonious behavior, she was the very Margarita that his uncle had spoken about. The boy was indignant that Margarita had gotten violent and was asking where the dining room was. Ethan declared that only members of the de Hart family ate in the dining room, and whoever gave the right to an outsider like her to sit at the same table with them, he would not put up with her and would drive her out. Margot was surprised. The servants obeyed her without question. But with this little one, everything was different. But could this frighten her? The girl decided that it would even be interesting to try to tame this tiger cub. Margarita looked down on the guy and haughtily said that she didn't remember asking his permission to live in the mansion. The girl needed only one thing: for the guy to show her where to go to the dining room, where her father and uncle were waiting for her. Margot said that this was the only thing she needed from him, and then the guy could get lost. Ethan was indignant. How dare she mock him and speak so rudely? She completely lost her fear. Margarita retorted, "He is the one making fun of her. Where is his conscience? He is calling a girl a stranger who has barely crossed the threshold of the house and is connected to him by blood ties." The girl stated that she also does not yet consider the guy a relative, since relatives do not behave like that. The guy was indignant. How could she speak like that to the eldest grandson of de Hart? Margot replied that it meant that they really were one family, and it was not for him to decide whether to recognize her or not. Ethan called Margot impudent. The girl was indignant. Did he really continue to bully someone who is weaker than him? Margot is happy that she has a cool older brother. The boy liked being called a cool older brother. It was a thought-provoking phrase. Ethan turned away abruptly and walked away. The girl tried to stop him, but Ethan said that she should not follow him. He was going in a completely different direction. At that moment, one of the maids appeared. The girl was surprised to see the young gentleman talking in the corridor. The maid thought that the children got along well, and maybe even became friends. This situation made her happy. Ethan wanted to be indignant, and already opened his mouth to object to the girl. But the maid said that the young gentleman should hurry. They were already waiting in the dining room. Margot teased her brother. He said that he was going to a completely different place. The boy growled at Margot, and she quietly laughed. The future sword genius was a rather cute child. The maid asked Margarita how she managed to get so lost. Her room was closest to the dining room. The girl realized that she was lost in the 3 Pines. She was walking in circles and did not even notice it. Ethan took the opportunity to tease his sister, grumbling that she should remember the way and not cause people unnecessary trouble and not be a disgrace. The guy left, saying that the girl should, in any case, remember who is in charge in this house. Margot believed that de Hart's offspring could have expressed himself more politely. Margarita decided not to dwell on Ethan. Now she was about to meet his family for the first time, and she needed to get a good idea of what they were like. The girl entered the dining room. Bernard was already there and was apparently impatiently awaiting her appearance. The woman sitting at the table next to Ethan admired Margot's appearance and thought she was charming. Madame admitted that she should have greeted Bernard's daughter earlier and apologized for the delay. Margarita curtsied gracefully, greeted everyone gathered at the table, and introduced herself. Madame, who was actually Ethan's mother, the beautiful Irene, welcomed her new relative and invited her to the table. Margarita settled into the chair assigned to her and turned her attention to the man sitting on the other side of Ethan. It was Ethan's father and Bernard's younger brother, Edward DeHart, who didn't even consider it necessary to look at Margaret. Compared to Edward, Bernard and Ethan looked like angels. A heavy aura spread around the younger brother. The girl decided that it would be difficult to get along with him. Irene asked how old Lady Margot was, and the girl was initially glad that at least someone was keeping up the conversation in this tense atmosphere. But Margot's joy immediately vanished. She realized that she didn't know the correct answer to this question. Bernard looked meaningfully at Margarita. It seemed he himself had no idea how old his lost daughter might be. Margot decided to state her age as 9 years old, which greatly surprised Ethan. The boy burst into an angry tirade. This girl, 2 years younger than him, dared to behave so brazenly towards him. The boy's father's reaction to his tirade was immediate. Edward quietly but firmly said only his son's name, and a dead silence fell over the dining room. Edward apologized to everyone for his offspring's rude behavior and immediately announced that Ethan would have to run 20 extra laps tomorrow as punishment. Margarita realized that there was no warmth between father and son. They were separated from each other by an icy wall. This was the true face of this family. The boy sat silently at the table. His appetite had disappeared, and he was only serving out the time required by etiquette. Margarita, unlike Ethan, ate willingly, but realized that the fact of being born into a noble family is not a guarantee of happiness. This made her uncomfortable. The next morning was cozy. Margot decided that she had been too nervous yesterday, but she had grasped the main point of the events. Margot decided that in order to be accepted into this mansion, she needed to make the whole family happy and not think only about herself. The girl decided that she needed to start with her eldest grandson, Ethan, especially since she had already had the opportunity to do so this morning. The girl pulled back the curtains and saw her older brother diligently running around the training ground, following his father's instructions. These were the same 20 extra laps that Edward forced the guy to run. Apparently, the Hart family was not one to throw words to the wind. They kept their promises. Margarita decided that Ethan could use some more love from his own relatives, and she could help him with that. Ethan had easily completed the required laps and was now easily completing the extra ones when he suddenly heard a girl's voice calling his name. The guy looked back and saw that his new cousin was catching up with him. Margot easily caught up with Ethan and suggested that they run together. The boy noted that Margarita ran easily and freely and was not out of breath at all. Ethan asked what Margot was doing there, and the girl replied that she intended to serve her sentence with him, since she was the cause of it. Ethan ordered Margot to stop, but she replied that she was not asking his permission, but was running because she wanted to. The guy was indignant. He had noticed since yesterday that Margot was calling her simply by her first name. In fact, he was 2 years older than her and deserved to be treated with respect. Margot knew this, but pretended not to understand what it meant. Ethan declared that she should call him Big Brother. Margarita clarified how she could call him an older brother if he didn't consider her part of his family. Ethan was confused. He did not expect such a turn of events because of yesterday's words, and Margot clarified that maybe he wanted to become closer to her since he wanted her to call him that. The boy began to object categorically, but Margot realized that Ethan was simpler than he wanted to seem, and it would be easy to get along with him. The girl agreed to call Ethan her big brother, on the condition that he fulfill one of her requests. Margarita wanted Ethan to become her swordsmanship teacher, and then she would address him with respect. Ethan expected any request, but not this one. A former commoner, and even a girl, suddenly wanted to learn fencing. It was a shock to him. Margot knew that Ethan was learning swordsmanship from his father, Edward, captain of the King's Guard. Edward DeHart was one of the best swordsmen of the Barbados Empire and neighboring countries. In the novel, the plot developed mainly around the head of this family, Lord Salvador, so Margot knew practically nothing about Edward. The girl assumed that if she became Ethan's apprentice, and therefore his father's, she would be able to obtain information not only about them, but about the entire DeHart family. Ethan categorically refused to teach such a brat as Margarita. The girl did not expect that he would easily agree to her proposal. The guy said that the sword is not a toy. It is a dangerous weapon. Margosha did not consider his argument serious. He just had to teach her, that's all. But Ethan agreed. Margarita knew 2 ways to get what she wanted. The first was to negotiate. If the first didn't work, then the second method could be used, which consisted of taking away what was desired by force. Margot offered a deal. If she defeated him in a duel, Ethan would fulfill her request. The boy was against it. He was trained by his father, the captain of the Imperial Knights, and agreeing to a duel with an inept girl would be tantamount to shame for Ethan. Margarita stated that if she asked for training, it does not mean that she is a complete zero in the art of the swordsman. Margot wondered if her father or uncle had ever told Ethan that she had grown up in the slums, where she had been taught the art of the sword by real war heroes. So it is still unknown who is cooler, and in general, Margot is capable of giving a rebuff to Ethan's father, and his uncle, and any other knight of the Empire. Margarita decided that Ethan needed to be provoked, so she bragged so much. The girl saw Ethan looking behind her, and his face taking on a wary, stony expression. This always happened when the boy saw his father, especially now, when Margot boasted. And he himself looked not at all aristocratic. But Margarita was delighted with Edward's appearance. She generally liked the men of the de Hart family, one more handsome than the other. Margot looked at Ethan's father with admiration. Her uncle was magnificent. Even in his coldness, he inspired admiration. Edward looked at the girl with cold contempt. Margot decided that he had heard everything, and her aristocratic life would end right now. Margarita shifted awkwardly from foot to foot. Her boastful speech could cost her dearly. Edward asked his son what was the reason for the commotion he and his cousin had caused. The younger Count de Hart looked menacing, but remained stunningly handsome, and this beauty gave Margaret courage. The girl answered before Ethan could, stating that she had challenged her cousin to a sword fight, and that if she won, she wanted her uncle to train her as well. Edward was taken aback by the courage and determination of this little girl, and became interested in Margarita. The man asked if Lady Margaret really wanted to fight Ethan with swords, and if she had hit her head to suggest such a thing. Margarita was about to take offense and respond with something harsh, but she heard familiar footsteps behind her. Bernard, who unexpectedly appeared in the training arena, warned his brother to watch his language and not insult his daughter. The girl really wanted her adopted father to add that she was of sound mind and capable of fighting her cousin. Bernard said that a little fun wouldn't hurt them all, and offered to make a bet with his brother. The children were surprised. They thought that he would be against their duel. Edward was convinced that this was a waste of time with a predetermined outcome, but Bernard advised his brother not to be so self-confident. Since Edward was so confident in his own son, Bernard offered him to bet on the rights to develop the Cius River, which was located on his territory. In the event of Lady Margaret's defeat, Edward would receive exclusive rights to the siege weapon that Bernard was currently developing. Margarita decided that the brothers were joking. They were putting the resources of their lands at stake because of a children's duel. It was incredible. Edward agreed to let Margarita fight Ethan. From Margot's point of view, it was noble. But Bernard was very surprised. The new father was unaware of his daughter's abilities. But for some reason, he believed in her success. Bernard told the girl that the right to develop the river was at stake. It was a profitable business. He trusted her confidence and believed in success himself. Margarita was serious, and Bernard decided that she was unhappy about something. He believed that the girl should be happy about his trust. Margosha smiled slyly and asked whether, in the event of her victory, the rights to develop the river would really go to Bernard, and that in that case, she would receive it personally. Bernard laughed. So that's how she looks at this issue. That's wonderful. He promises that if Margot wins, he will give her 500 gold pieces. Bernard hoped that Margarita would live up to his expectations and that she had her own plan to defeat Ethan. Margosha promised her daddy that she would give it her all, since it was a matter of 500 gold coins. Bernard was surprised. And who did she take after? So selfish. The girl smiled. Definitely not after him. Maybe she shouldn't even worry. Margarita could not even guess what Bernard's true intentions were. But now she had no time for that. Her finest hour was coming. The girl hoped that she would be able to get training from a real sword master and earn a tidy sum. But Bernard was worried about whether she knew how to fight with swords. The girl replied that she had experience, and Bernard suggested that they have a one-round fight, with the winner being the one who was able to land the first blow to the opponent's body. The man who trained Margosha was a true war hero who had been in many battles. Ethan was forced to agree to the strange sparring and prepared for the fight. Margot remembered how Gunther, a former warrior and now a tavern owner, said that in a real fight, it was easier for a half-baked girl, even one as small as she, to to win. Professionals make the same mistakes over and over again that can cost them their lives when they find themselves on the battlefield. Edward and Bernard watched the children's fight with interest, both wondering how it would all end. The fathers gave the command to begin, and Margot immediately began to put her plan into practice. Ethan expected his cousin to approach him and try to strike him with a sword, but Margot decided to act completely differently. The girl was told that the main mistake of professionals is their desire to fight fairly. She could not allow herself to do this, and therefore threw a sword at her brother. The unexpected reception surprised both DeHart brothers. They simply froze in surprise. Ethan never expected to get hit in the forehead with a sword without even making a single lunge. Gunther was right when he said that anyone bound by the code of knightly honor naively assumes that their opponent will play by their rules. That's exactly what happened. Ethan was knocked down, and then off his feet. Margot wasn't going to give her opponent time to recover. The girl immediately climbed onto her fallen brother and filled the yard with a cry of victory. It was all predictable. Ethan simply couldn't help but fall for her trick. He was too confident in himself and his swordsmanship. Pinned to the ground, strangled and disarmed, the boy could not immediately believe that his cousin had committed such an outrage. Margot admitted that she didn't have much strength in her body, but she was able to win. Edward announced to everyone that the fight was over, which came as a surprise to Ethan. The guy started to object. He didn't even have time to make one lunge, and Margot broke every conceivable rule of combat. Edward reminded them that there was an agreement that the one who struck the first blow would win, and Margot did it, unfortunately, in a real fight. Ethan would already be dead. Ethan didn't understand why this was enough for his father to admit defeat. He still believed the fight was unfair. Edward also considered Margot's reception dirty. He was completely unworthy of the title of knight. But Margot is not a knight, Edward chuckled. And in a real battle, the main thing is to catch the enemy off guard and kill him, in which case her practice is incredibly effective. Uncle asked who was Margot's mentor, who exactly taught her this technique. The girl replied that her mentor was Sir Gunther. Now he is just a tavern owner in Western Barbados. Margarita was the winner and could talk to Ethan's father almost as an equal. Edward thought for a moment, then ordered his son to follow him. It was time for the boy's real preparation. Margarita was perplexed. From Edward's reaction, she concluded that he was acquainted with Sir Gunther. Bernard could hardly contain his delight until his brother and son left. He was in admiration of his own daughter and thought that she was a great girl. The Count decided that a reward of 500 gold pieces for such a brave fighter as Margotia was not enough. Maybe his daughter wanted something else. Bernard lowered his hand to the girl's head, wanting to stroke her, but it wasn't very gentle. For Margot, it was like a slap on the back of the head. The girl was indignant. If her father wanted to pat her on the head, he should be more gentle and not slap her on the back of the head. Bernard apologized and promised to fulfill any wish of his wonderful daughter. Without thinking twice, Margarita made her most cherished wish. She really made it, but Bernard had to fulfill it. Count Salvador was having a blast. His eldest son's newly discovered daughter was incredibly funny. She made Ethan flinch from just one blow. The head of the family was eager to meet this girl in person. After all, she was another of his granddaughters. Salvador was grateful to his eldest son for bringing such an extraordinary personality into the house. If we think about it sensibly, then young Master Ethan was defeated by means of unfair means, someone present noted. Salvador frowned and stated that in a real fight, when life and death were at stake, there was no such thing as honor. Is it really better to boast about the death of a brave man when you go to the next world than to stand alive and well over the corpse of an enemy? Salvador asked. The objector hastened to fall to his knees and offer his apologies to the all-powerful head of the Hart family without waiting for the old man's wrath to fall upon him. Salvador believed that after death, everything loses its meaning. In a duel, everything is simple. Either you kill or you are killed. The subordinates did not dare to object to the commander. They understood that Salvador was absolutely right. Salvador decided that he could find a common language with his granddaughter. He already liked this girl, and the Lord decided not to delay. Salvador left his residence and went to the DeHart mansion. He decided that he wanted to visit his lovely granddaughter as soon as possible. Margarita stood in front of the closed door to the dining room, dying of impatience. The girl was unhappy that she was made to wait for so long. She thought that her cherished wish would be fulfilled much faster. The maid reported that everything was ready, as she requested, and invited Lady Margaret to enter. Margot hadn't yet decided what to do with the 500 gold pieces and made an additional wish. Not very significant, but something she had always dreamed of. The girl thought that she would, of course, do something that would please Ethan, but first she wanted to please herself. And to her delight, 100 strawberry chocolate desserts, prepared according to different recipes, were displayed on the table in front of Margot. It was her sweet dream. Each dessert had its own unique taste and was prepared in a local kitchen by the hands of a true professional. Count Bernard was a man of his word and fulfilled the girl's cherished wish. It was exactly what she wanted. It was time to test how skilled the DeHart Mansion's pastry chef was, which Margot quickly did. Suddenly, the girl fell from her chair, which frightened her maids, and the girls became terribly alarmed. The young lady is feeling unwell. Are the desserts poisoned, or is she suffering from indigestion from eating too many sweets? Should they call a doctor? Margot announced that everything was fine. She had simply fainted for a moment from the divine taste of one of the desserts, and asked the girls for forgiveness for it. The maids asked not to frighten them like that again. They decided to leave the lady alone with her happiness and wished to enjoy the treat in no hurry. The maid girls came to the sad conclusion that if the lady was so happy with ordinary desserts, then her life had not been sweet at all. Margarita was left alone with her dream. Devouring sweets, she reasoned. From the very first day of her stay in the mansion, she was on pins and needles, but at night she slept soundly. Now she decided to eat her fill, although she never complained about her appetite. Then someone's black head loomed next to Margot's chair. Large red eyes, full of longing and request, looked straight at Margosha. Margarita was perplexed when this child managed to enter the room. She did not hear any footsteps or the sound of the door opening. The girl was charming and so tiny, much smaller than Margarita herself. There was no doubt about it. This was Ethan's younger sister, another child of Edward and Irene, little Morticia. The girl was incredibly similar to her brother, but her facial features were much sweeter and more delicate, as befits a girl. Margarita noticed that Morticia was looking longingly at one of the desserts. She clearly wanted to eat a piece of cake. Margot realized that it would be awkward if she didn't treat Morticia. The little girl smiled and reached out her hands to the plate with the treat. The little girl was so sweet and not at all capricious. It was impossible to refuse such an angel anything. Margot thought Lady Morticia should be spoiled with sweets, but you couldn't tell from the girl's appearance. She handed the little girl a spoon and offered her a treat. Margosha couldn't understand why Morticia was looking at her so timidly and didn't dare touch the cake. She convinced the girl not to be shy. There was a lot here. The child timidly took the plate and had just raised his dessert fork over the cake when a loud warning cry came from the door. A maid who accidentally entered the room strictly forbade Lady Morticia to touch the dessert. Margarita didn't expect anyone to scream so loudly and flinched in surprise. Morticia dropped the plate with dessert and ran out of the room in fear. Margarita tried to catch up with her and calm her down, but the maid stopped her. The girl said that Lady Morticia was in poor health and was constantly taking medication, which meant she couldn't eat sweets. Margot was simply scared. She almost fed Morticia something that could harm the girl. Morticia looked at the cake with such delight, Margot remembered. It was simply impossible not to give in to those sweet eyes. The girl felt sorry for her cousin. She was born into a noble and wealthy family, but she couldn't even eat a piece of cake. The fragments of the plate lay sadly on the floor, mixed with the unmixed dessert. Without delaying for long, Margarita decided to visit Morticia in her room. The girl was drawing when Margarita entered the room. She was so engrossed that she didn't pay attention to Margot. Margarita was touched. Morticia was so charming that her chest ached. Morticia raised her pretty head. She was not expecting guests and was surprised by Margarita's visit. Margot handed her a bag of healthy sweets. It was a good way to please the girl. Margarita said that she prepared these treats with Leah, and they would be good for Morticia. These desserts have a simple taste, but they are made from healthy ingredients without the use of sugar or wheat flour. Leah allowed Morticia to eat a little. They consulted with the doctor, and he was not against it. Morticia could not worry and boldly help herself. The girl took the treat with trepidation. Her eyes filled with a strange moisture. Morticia turned away abruptly and began to quickly draw something. Margot was a little surprised by the girl's behavior. Morticia handed the girl a piece of paper with something written on it. Margarita apologized to Morticia. She couldn't read and therefore couldn't understand what the girl wrote. In her defense, Margot thought that even if she could, she would hardly understand the meaning of Morticia's scribbles. Morticia found a way out of the situation. She turned away again and spent a long time drawing something on a piece of paper. Margarita looked at the children's scribbles with curiosity and was surprised. What Morticia drew was so sweet and spontaneous that Margarita tenderly hugged the girl. The girl just wanted to say thank you to her cousin, so she drew her and Margot hugging each other tightly. Morticia drew a simply wonderful picture and gave it to Margot, who never tired of admiring it, and decided that the brother and sister had nothing in common in their personalities. Margot immediately admitted she was wrong. Ethan sometimes had sweet traits in his character, but mostly he was harsh and rude. Everything was fine, but Margot decided that she needed to learn to read and write as soon as possible. From now on, she would have to lead a lifestyle befitting a real lady. The girl heard sobs, and after a few steps, she saw the source of the sad sounds. Margarita wondered what could have brought her unshakable cousin to such a sad state. Ethan sat all alone in a secluded corner of the garden, sobbing softly. Margarita did not immediately approach her cousin. The girl hid behind the bushes and carefully watched Ethan. Margosha was no good as a spy because Ethan quickly realized that someone was watching him. The boy decided that they were enemies and prepared to repel the attack, but Margot shouted a warning that he shouldn't worry. It was only her. Ethan was surprised by his cousin's unexpected appearance in the garden at such a late hour. The boy was indignant. Margot should be more careful. He almost hit her with a sword. The girl said that it was her own fault and asked why Ethan was sitting there all alone. Margot asked her brother if he had really been crying. Judging by the marks on his face, he really had. Ethan categorically denied this possibility and calmly stated that Margot was mistaken. Margot was surprised. Her brother was sad, but surprisingly calm and balanced. The girl wondered where all of Ethan's enthusiasm had gone. She thought he would get angry and yell at her again. Margarita sat down next to the boy and asked what was upsetting him so much. Ethan sighed heavily. He decided to tell Margot everything, but he couldn't find the words. The issue was the young gentleman's psychological state. It seemed to him that he would need Margarita's help. Margot was surprised that Ethan was really asking her for help now, but that couldn't be true. The girl's eyes widened even more when her cousin admitted that after the fight with her, the boy was unable to concentrate on the fight. Ethan admitted that he couldn't even hold a sword properly. After losing to Margot, he realized that all his previous efforts had been in vain. Margot was outraged. Ethan shouldn't say and think like that. She cheated and used a dirty trick. Ethan objected. The fact remains, he lost. Today, the guy came out here to train, but he no longer knows what the point is. The guy had lost his way. He kept thinking that he had been on the wrong path from the very beginning. He considered himself simply untalented. Such words angered Margot. The girl was scared. Because of her, the future swordmaster considered himself a mediocrity. She cannot ignore this. Who will then stand up to defend the empire? Margarita asked Ethan with concern if he was really going to quit training. The boy replied that this was out of the question. The heir of DeHart could not but wield a sword. The guy had no intention of giving up, so he asked Margarita to help him overcome his uncertainty. Ethan said that regular training was not enough for him. He needed a completely different approach, so he asked Margot to introduce him to the person who trained the girl. The girl thought about it. Now she understood why Ethan was destined to become the best swordsman in the Barbados Empire, and why the Count had high hopes for him. This guy is so tenacious that he will undoubtedly become the greatest blade master in all of Barbados. The town greeted the children with the same dirty streets and sooty walls. Margot and Ethan made their way through the market crowd. No one paid any attention to the children, and there was always the danger that they would be trampled. Ethan felt uncomfortable, and when he accidentally fell a little behind Margot, he became completely confused. The girl was surprised why her cousin was stuck in the middle of the street, and even loudly shouting her name when he himself was no more than 5 steps behind. The guy was angry. Firstly, he told Margot to call him Big Brother. And why did they put on these rags? Because of them, he can hardly see where to go. Margot was indignant. Her cousin was completely stupid. If children of noble birth were noticed in this hole, unaccompanied, they would become a target for bandits. The girl advised her brother to wrap himself up better so that his noble features would not be recognized in the crowd. Ethan became indignant and wanted to hit the girl, but Margot deftly intercepted his hand and told him to calm down and not act like a little child. The guy realized that he was wrong. He himself begged Margot to help him, and now he lost his composure and shamefully trudged after his cousin. The girl reassured her brother that they would arrive soon. The place they needed was located just beyond this block, but an unexpected meeting could disrupt all the boys' plans. Right in front of them, boys from a local gang appeared. The leader recognized the boy as the Count's son and intended to pinch the aristocrat. Ethan told Margot that they had been discovered, and the girl couldn't understand how this could have happened. The guy told Margot to step aside. He decided that he could deal with these guys himself. Ethan found that he had lost his wooden sword, his only weapon, and with the bandits approaching, the leader became curious about what these brats were whispering about. The guy decided that they had only one way out. Margot had to run away. But the girl objected that she couldn't leave her unarmed brother alone. Ethan stated that Margot shouldn't worry about him. She needed to escape while he distracted them. Then she could bring help to him. Margarita understood her brother's plan and ran away, wishing her cousin to survive. The bandits tried to detain the girl, but to no avail. Escape was the only way out. Margot would have to make a detour, but she urgently needed to find Mr. Gunther and ask for help. She ran and hit the legs of a man in a cloak, with a sword in his hands. He was perplexed as to where the offspring of a noble family had appeared in this hole. The man saw that a whole group of city bandits were chasing the girl, with clearly non-peaceful intentions. The man drew his sword and dispersed the girl's pursuers in an instant. Margarita just opened her mouth in surprise at how quickly and deftly he managed to do everything. One of the bandits decided to take Margot's cousin hostage and use the boy to protect himself from the children's unexpected savior. The man declared that he had already warned these guys more than once not to touch children, even if they were aristocrats 3 times over. The man regretted that these guys don't learn anything. Didn't they understand that it was life-threatening? Margot recognized her savior and was delighted. It was the one they were looking for, Mr. Gunther himself. Gunther didn't recognize the girl, but Margarita was glad that she met him here and now. Gunther asked the girl who she was, how she knew his name, and why she was so happy. Margot wondered if she had really changed that much in such a short time, or if Gunther had simply forgotten about her. The girl was outraged that Gunther could so quickly forget about his best student. Gunther took a closer look at the girl and laughed happily. Margot had become so beautiful that he hardly recognized her. They were already sitting at a table in Gunther's tavern and talking. The mentor was glad that Margot had been taken in by the Count's family. Gunther joked about what Margot was doing here, or whether she had already been kicked out. The girl had such a character that not everyone could stand it. Margarita didn't react to Gunther's joke. The girl introduced her cousin to the mentor, saying that his name was Ethan. She wanted to explain why they came. Ethan interrupted the girl and asked Gunther to teach him how to use a sword. Margarita was indignant. Ethan shouldn't have declared his intentions so openly. Gunther asked if the boy really came to the city just to become Gunther's student. He guessed that he had been training for a long time. The tavern owner said that his services were expensive. Could the young gentleman afford it? Margot was sure that Ethan had money. He was the son of rich parents. However, the conversation about payment caused confusion and bewilderment on the boy's face, and Margot realized that the guy didn't have a penny. Margot asked Ethan where all his pocket money went, or if he was one of those people who spend it all at once. Ethan replied that he was almost never given cash. His parents bought everything he needed, and he lived without thinking about money. Margarita didn't know what to do with them. She had no savings, except for the 500 gold coins she had shaken out of Bernard for defeating Ethan. This money was supposed to be enough to pay for Gunther's services. Margot gave it to Ethan, but made him promise that he would someday repay her debt. Gunther decided that since Margot was paying out of her own pocket, he would give Ethan a discount and charge him only 500 gold pieces. Margarita was glad that she would have at least a few gold coins left, but disappointment came as soon as she heard the amount named. Gunther named a sum equal to all her savings, and now the girl again had 0 gold coins in her pocket. The tavern owner took a closer look at Ethan and decided that he reminded him of someone. Margot clarified that Gunther was also acquainted with Lord Edward de Hart. Gunther got angry as soon as he heard the name of Ethan's father, and asked Margot how she knew this nasty guy. Margot answered honestly that Lord Edward was her uncle and Ethan's father. She had no intention of hiding anything from her mentor. The girl wondered if Mr. Gunther really didn't know that Count Edward was a member of the de Hart family and the youngest son of Lord Salvador. Gunther said that he met Edward on the battlefield, and their titles don't matter. The children listened to Gunther's story. It turned out that Edward had used Gunther as bait to break into the enemy camp and left him to die without help. The tavern owner got angry. The scar on his face appeared due to the fault of Ethan's father, and he was his senior in rank at the time. Gunther believed that Edward was lucky that they had won that day. Otherwise, he would not have escaped punishment. The tavern owner said that, despite the fact that Edward is usually unusually calm, the sight of blood simply blows his mind. Then this guy goes crazy and starts doing inexplicable things. Gunther warned Margot that whatever she did, she should try not to bleed in front of Edward de Hart. The girl was surprised by the unexpected revelations about her new relative. Since the girl paid everything at once, the former mentor decided to give her a bonus and tell her about her new uncle's weak spot. Margot was glad to hear this information. It would be useful to her for survival in the de Hart family mansion. The children were wary, expecting to hear something scary. But it turned out that Ethan's father's main weakness was that he was partial to everything cute. This was the most important and most terrible secret of the man, whom those around him considered the Ice Count. The children made the return journey to the mansion in a creaking cart belonging to one of the peasants returning from the city. Margot was glad that Sir Gunther had left them just enough money for the journey home. The girl couldn't believe it. Uncle Edward loved everything cute. It didn't fit in her head. It turned out that it was still possible to get along with him. However, Margot had not yet become particularly close to her biological father. Ethan objected. It seemed to him that Bernard treated Margot warmly. The girl asked if her father really liked her, and why Ethan decided so. The boy replied that his intuition told him that his uncle was more gentle with Margot than with other people. Bernard is usually strict with children, but Margot allowed them to learn the art of the sword, and not everyone is allowed to do that. Margot assumed that he was simply using her for the rights to the waterway, and that she had entered into this deal for the reward. Ethan objected. It's not that. It's just that his uncle himself doesn't realize how he feels about Margarita. Bernard is not the type to make risky deals, and a deal that trades gun control rights for waterway rights is not an equal one. That's why Ethan's father agreed to this duel. He understood perfectly well that if his son won, he would be the clear winner. Bernard didn't even give up the rights to the siege weapons to the royal family, and then he suddenly put such a thing on the line in a children's duel. It was simply unthinkable. Ethan assumed that Bernard wanted to give Marguerite a chance to prove herself, which she used brilliantly. Margarita remembered the pride Bernard had looked at her with when she had defeated Ethan. The boy envied his cousin. Her father believes in her, and this is incredible luck. Ethan believed that everything in his life was different. His own father only instructed him or punished him. Margot remembered how distant Ethan's father had seemed from his family and children at dinner, how indifferent he had been to his son. The girl was annoyed that even though Ethan was a future master of the blade, he was now just an 11-year-old boy who longed for his parents' love and approval. Margot told Ethan that his courage and resourcefulness today amazed her. Her uncle knew about his son's merits, which is why he placed such a big bet on him. The boy agreed with Margot. Perhaps he was simply prejudiced against his father, but in reality, he just wanted Ethan to grow up to be a strong man. After such a pleasant conversation, the children reached the de Hart mansion and wanted to quietly return to their rooms. Margarita was in a hurry. It was late. She slipped away without permission, so Leah is probably furious. The girls suggested to her cousin to hurry, otherwise they would have to tell everything to their father and uncle. The children quietly entered the mansion, thinking that they could sneak in unnoticed, and they had almost succeeded. Ethan's gut instinct was screaming that they wouldn't succeed, but Margot urged her brother to hurry. Ethan stopped Margot, and they were met with a terrible sight that they should not have seen. Ethan's father was lying unconscious on the floor. The boy was worried. His father was in excellent health, and suddenly, such an incident happened. Unexpectedly, the head of the de Hart family appeared before the children. Grandfather declared that he had been waiting for his grandchildren for a long time. Margot was glad to finally meet Lord Salvador, but the setting for the meeting was not very convenient. The head of the de Hart family, and the most powerful man in the empire, sat comfortably on the stomach of his own son, who lay in a deep swoon. Salvador Haran de Hart looked at his dumbfounded grandchildren with a grin. The boys would have a lot to explain to him. In front of Margot was her grandfather, but he looked much younger than the girl had imagined. What's more, his youngest son looked worse. Margot had read that Salvador was young and handsome beyond his years. but she couldn't bring herself to call the man she saw before her a grandfather. Salvador looked young and energetic, yet he exuded an all-consuming grandeur that was not found in ordinary young men. Margot saw the aura surrounding Lord Salvador. It seemed as if the girl could touch the threads swirling around him. Salvador patted Edward's chest, still lying unconscious on the floor, and invited Margarita to sit down next to him. Margarita understood that if she sat on her uncle's chest, it would be a real disaster, at least for her. What a strange man, the girl thought. How can he give such terrible orders with such a calm expression? Margot had no choice but to cheat. She had one clever trick in store for such a case. The technique, honed to perfection, worked flawlessly. Margarita pretended not to understand who was sitting in front of her. Salvador didn't expect his granddaughter to be so slow-witted. He had been told that she was a very smart girl. Ethan wanted to warn Margot that it was her grandfather, but the girl did not listen to him. She loudly declared that whoever he was, it was impolite to sit on an uncle. Salvador laughed. He just taught Edward the rules of our house. Margarita was indignant. Is this how they teach rules? This is beyond all bounds, and the young man should immediately get up from her uncle. The girl categorically and sternly stated that no matter how angry the young man was, he had to show respect to his elders. Witnesses of this scene expected that incredible punishments would now fall on the girl's head. Could the head of the family really tolerate such treatment from a little girl? Ethan expected the same thing. Only a crazy person, or someone who didn't know any fear, could call his grandfather his father's younger brother, which is basically the same thing. A silent scene arose in the hall. The servants held their breath, awaiting the inevitable storm in the form of Lord Salvador's wrath. Margot acted quite consciously. She knew perfectly well that any adult loves to be told that he looks young, even if he understands that it is flattery. As people get older, they cling more to the visual appearance of youth, and there was some doubt that Salvador would fall for it. The trick worked. Lord Salvador burst into loud laughter, astonishing those around him with his ringing, youthful laughter. Margarita was a little scared. Who knows? Maybe he was laughing before giving the order to throw her out of the estate. Salvador wiped away the tears of laughter that had welled up in his eyes. He hadn't laughed like that in a long time. Margot called him her grandfather, the younger brother of her younger son, and that was wonderful. The head of the family, despite his menacing appearance, was not without coquetry. Salvador asked the servants if he really looked so young. When Grandpa declared that his granddaughter was even funnier than he expected, Margot realized that her trick seemed to have worked. Salvador stopped laughing and announced that he was not going to move from his spot anyway. Edward was at fault. He went to the battlefield without permission and brought trouble upon himself. The head of the family categorically stated. Margarita felt her grandfather's aura with her whole body. It was an oppressive pressure, a simply deadly effect. Ethan was the first to rush to Margot. He saw that the girl was feeling ill. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't even utter a word. Just a moment ago, Margot had considered Salvador an incredibly handsome man, but now he only evoked pity in her. If this continued, she would feel really bad. Something incredible was happening before Ethan's eyes. A girl much younger than him was successfully resisting Salvador's mental pressure. The servants looked at this incident as something incredible, something they had never seen before. Overcoming the pressure and gasping for breath, Margarita tried to say as clearly as possible that it was wrong and ugly to act like that, even with a stranger. It's especially unnatural when they treat their own son so disdainfully, Margot blurted out, with a painful exhalation. Once she did that, it became a little easier, and she continued, all children are similar. They desperately crave parental approval. No child in the world deserves to be abused, Margarita stated categorically and courageously. Salvador became angry. For the first time in a long time, he felt worthy resistance. And from whom? From a little girl who had not yet really become part of his family. It is unknown what would have happened next, but Ethan saved the situation. He hid Margot behind his back and asked his grandfather for forgiveness. The boy stated that Margot had only recently arrived at the estate and didn't know a lot of things. He would talk to her himself, and if anyone deserved punishment, it was him. Margarita was confused as to why Ethan was doing this in order to protect her from their common relative. This, so to speak, grandfather was much scarier than Ethan's father, and the boy so fearlessly rushed to protect Margot. Something unexpected happened. Salvador grinned and said that since both his grandsons insisted, he would get up. Salvador loudly declared that his grandchildren were real daredevils, and he had no doubt about them. The head of the family took out an elegant dagger, just the right size and fittings for a 9-year-old girl, and handed it to Margot. Salvador asked his granddaughter to accept his gift and never part with it. Grandfather knew that Margot had defeated Ethan in a duel through cunning, but it was still a victory, so he decided to give her this dagger for self-defense. Margarita tried out the weapon and was completely delighted. It was magnificent. In front of the stunned servants, Lord Salvador took his granddaughter by the hand and said, "Welcome to the estate. Now this is her home too." At that moment, Margarita realized that she had won the young heart of the old lord. Margot couldn't even imagine that she would meet Salvador. He was spoken of as a busy man. But after this meeting, the grandfather loved spending time with his granddaughter. Salvador especially enjoyed combing Margarita's hair and creating cute hairstyles. Margarita thought that her paths with the head of the family would rarely cross. But in reality, everything was different. Whenever Lord Salvador got bored, he would call Margot to chat with her. The grandfather was also interested in how his granddaughter lived before Bernard found her. Salvador also had conversations with the girl about political topics, although she was not very pleased with this. One day, my grandfather reported that the emperor had requested troops from the Hart family for the war against Babylon. But things were not going well at the front. Margot wondered if there was any point in sending troops where defeat was inevitable. They were simply sending people to certain death. Salvador agreed with his granddaughter, but if he refused, he would incur the wrath of the imperial family and asked the girl what he should do. Margarita was surprised why he was asking her such things. She was very small and did not understand many things. Margot did not answer. The grandfather himself decided to refuse the emperor. The hairstyle, as always, turned out great. Salvador joked that when he was fired from all his posts, he would go and do hair for little ladies. Margarita never ceases to be amazed at how well Salvador braids and does hairstyles. Margosha asked how her grandfather had acquired so much experience in an occupation uncharacteristic of men, noblemen, as he had done someone's hair before. Salvador replied that he was doing this for the first time, but his granddaughter had soft hair and braiding it was a pleasure. The girl's grandfather told her that members of the Hart family quickly succeed in everything they undertake. Salvador was sure that Margot was the same. Since his blood flows through her, she will be the pride of the Hart family. Grandfather was sure of this. Salvador decided to lend Margot the book, The Emperor, and recommended that she read it before their next meeting. Margarita took the thick book and decided that forcing a small child to read something like this was real mockery. Salvador found the book interesting and useful, and was surprised by Margot's protest. Plus, Margarita told her grandfather, she simply doesn't know how to read, not at all. Margarita told the truth and realized that she had disappointed Salvador. It was a shame. She had just started to get used to the family, and suddenly such a bummer. At this rate, the status of the most beloved and charming granddaughter of the all-powerful grandfather will be under threat. Margarita humbly asked to be given at least a week to study and read the book. Salvador was surprised that Margarita needed a whole week to read this small book. It didn't seem like his granddaughter's style. Margosha claimed that in a week she would learn to read and write perfectly. The girl decided that this was her chance to restore her authority. What a sensation! The girl mastered reading in 1 week. Salvador thought for a moment and stunned Margot by telling her that she only had 3 days. Margarita was indignant. 3 days was not enough to remove all the gaps in her head. Had she really heard correctly? Salvador confirmed that she had heard everything correctly. A week was too long, and he was giving her 3 days to do everything. Margarita was perplexed as to how she could learn everything in 3 days and begged to be given at least 4 days. Salvador chuckled and announced that he had thought about it and decided that 2 days would be quite enough. Margarita didn't know what to say or do next. Her grandfather's demands seemed impossible to fulfill. Salvador was sure that Margot had the blood of their family, capable of quick learning, and it was necessary to find out whether the girl could demonstrate this ability. Grandfather believed that this situation was a chance for Margarita to prove that she had a predisposition to this ability. Salvador left his granddaughter no room for refusal, and there was no chance of her not completing the task. Margarita suspected that something like this would happen sooner or later. It was a test of her limits. The girl bravely took up reading the book. Even though she couldn't read, she reassured herself that she would succeed. Margarita struggled to make her way through the intricacies of reading and realized that not everything was as simple as she thought. Everything was much more complicated than she thought. There was no use in textbooks. She needed a teacher who could teach Margot to read. Ethan appeared in the room and asked if his cousin was still on the front page. Margot thought he was going to call her a fool. The girl told her brother that she had no time to play with him and that he should leave her alone. If Ethan can't and won't help her, then he can go about his business, Margot stated categorically. Ethan said that Margot shouldn't be angry. He would be happy to help her, and she didn't refuse to help him with training. Margarita couldn't believe her ears. Was the solution to all her problems really standing before her? Margot hung on her brother's neck with a joyful cry. Of course, she wanted him to help her. She couldn't handle it on her own in such a short time. The girl almost knocked Ethan off his feet. The boy was confused. He did not expect such a violent display of feelings from his cousin. Ethan was even indignant. He always asked Margot to call him her older brother. But the girl continued to be overly familiar. Margarita was ready to fulfill any demand of Ethan, if only he would teach her the intricate alphabet of the Barbados Empire. Ethan saw that Margarita was ready to work, which was nice and gave him hope for success. The boy decided to start from the very basics, and soon Morticia joined them. The three of them learned faster and more interestingly. Morticia soon got tired of looking at letters, and she took up her favorite pastime, drawing. After some time, the girl showed Margarita her masterpieces. Margot especially liked the drawing in which Ethan was depicted as a teacher. Diligently studying Margarita also looked incredibly cute from the point of view of the young artist. Morticia also drew herself. In the picture, she was diligently encouraging Margot, wishing her success in mastering reading. Margarita looked at Morticia in surprise. It turned out the girl had come to her room not out of simple curiosity. Morticia heard how difficult the task her grandfather had given Margot was, and came to encourage and support her sisters. A series of hugs followed, and despite the lack of time, Margarita could not resist hugging her little sister. Morticia's support did the trick, and Margot took up the work with even greater zeal. Not everything worked out right away, and the teacher, Ethan, was strict and picky. Margarita diligently learned letters and syllables. Writing in the Empire was complex. At the same time, Margot asked Ethan how he would answer his grandfather's question about the transfer of troops for imperial needs, and how to refuse without offending him. Ethan was perplexed. It was not at all difficult for his grandfather to refuse the emperor. They had been friends for a long time. Margot suspected some kind of catch in the matter. If she and the emperor were friends, then she didn't see any difficulty in refusing. The girl decided that now she should learn to read, and she could think about politics later. The next 2 days passed in persistent and continuous work. Margot took almost no breaks for food or sleep. Ethan and Morticia supported her. The former taught her everything he knew on the subject, and his sister supported her morally. The work was in full swing, and Margarita diligently studied the alphabet of the Empire and the book The Sovereign. The next morning, Ethan opened his eyes quite early and found that Margot was no longer asleep. The girl was sitting over a book and reading with interest. Most likely, she had not gone to bed at all. Ethan remembered that Margot had planned to go to bed early, but apparently she had gotten carried away and was still reading. The boy was pleased to look at his sister. Margarita was as stubborn as everyone else in the Hart family. If Margot took on something, she would see it through to the end, no matter what difficulties she encountered along the way. The long-awaited day had arrived, and Lord Salvador was waiting for Margotia to evaluate her abilities and skills. Margarita had learned everything and was ready for any questions Lord Salvador might ask. At least that's what she thought. The girl assumed that her grandfather would now ask her to read an excerpt from a book or something like that. The servants, Brother Ethan and Sister Morticia, were rooting for Margot. They believed that she would cope with all the tasks brilliantly. Margarita asked her grandfather if he would be satisfied if she read him an excerpt from the book he had given her last time. Salvador replied that this was indeed the case, and the girl opened the book to a random page and began to read loudly and expressively. Not a minute had passed before the Lord stopped Margotia. It was clear that she could now read. Salvador felt that this was not a skill to boast about. Everyone can read, and what many Barbadians do does not serve as proof. If Margarita really is from the Hart family, then she must demonstrate something more. The girl was at a loss as to what else her grandfather had come up with. Salvador demanded that Margot answer the question of how to refuse the emperor's request for the transfer of troops without insulting him. Margarita was shocked. So what should she answer the nasty old man? Exactly like that. Because despite his wrinkle-free face, Salvador was quite a bore. Margot was mentally indignant. There had been no such agreement. She thought that simply reading an excerpt from the book would be enough. Despair overwhelmed Margarita. She tried so hard, didn't sleep for 2 days, learned to read and write. And this unbearable old man changes his shoes in mid-air, like an acrobat, and instantly changes the rules of the game, based only on his own desires. Margarita looked with displeasure at Salvador, who was comfortably settled in his chair and waiting for her answer. The girl despaired. Would she never be accepted into the Hart family? And what would she do, I wonder? Would they throw her out into the street or send her to work on the farm? And Margot will continue to live unloved by anyone, just like in her past life. Ethan sympathized with Margarita, but he couldn't help her now. He didn't know the answer to this question. Grandfather Salvador asked why his granddaughter had been silent for so long. He had been waiting for her answer for so long. Margarita shook herself, wondering how she could answer her in a way that would at least sound witty. She studied for 2 days just to master reading and writing, and such a question required careful study and thought. The answer to this question did not occur to either Margarita or Ethan, and they had no time for it. Suddenly, Margarita remembered that Ethan had mentioned that the Emperor and her grandfather were old friends. Margarita already thought then that something was wrong here, but she was too busy to consider her assumption. Suddenly, the answer came to Margarita's mind. She only had to concentrate and remember the contents of the book. Margot clarified that grandfather didn't have to be careful with the Emperor, did he? Margarita reminded that the Emperor and Salvador Hart are longtime friends and know everything. The girl noted that in reality, the relationship between the Emperor of Barbados and Earl Hart was indeed unequal. Count Salvador Hart wields more power than the Emperor himself and can influence any member of the imperial family. This answer shocked everyone present. They had not even thought about the situation from this perspective. It was exactly like this. In the original story, Count Salvador possessed enormous strength, incredible skill, and unlimited power. Therefore, the Count did not have to worry about the Emperor's attitude towards him due to the refusal to send troops anywhere. Salvador found it strange that a girl so far removed from politics could know so precisely about his relationship with the imperial family. Margarita was confused. She couldn't say that she had read about this in a past life. A tense silence fell over the room as Lord Salvador waited for an answer. Margot's life was now at stake. Margarita quietly said that she had read it in a book. Then it dawned on her, and she answered much more confidently. The girl stated that over the past 2 days she had read many books and newspapers on this topic, from which it was very easy to draw such a conclusion. Having learned to read, Margot replied, she studied several historical works and newspaper articles and guessed the true relationship between the Lord and the imperial family. Salvador calmed down a little. If this was indeed the case, then he was ready to believe Margarita. The girl could only guess whether she had managed to justify herself or whether her grandfather was again dissatisfied with something, and whether she would be accepted into this family. Lord Salvador nodded his head and declared that Margarita had passed the test. In fact, she had said everything correctly. The girl was ready to breathe a sigh of relief. Could she really finally be recognized as a full-fledged member of this family? Margarita was glad that her torment would finally end, and she would be able to rest a little. Ethan, Morticia, and the servants rejoiced with her. Margot made a lot of efforts to please her grandfather, and they were witnesses to this. Salvador praised his granddaughter. She not only mastered literacy, but also managed to read in her spare time, which was worthy of a member of the de Hart family. Margarita considered the Lord's praise well-deserved, but that made it no less pleasant to listen to her. Salvador believed that his granddaughter had worked hard and had not brought shame on her grandfather's name. Margot eagerly awaited the end of her grandfather's tirade and the final verdict of the head of the family. His desire to drag out the ending irritated her. Margarita felt like the room was floating somewhere, and her grandfather's silhouette was blurring. The girl staggered and fainted. Salvador did not expect that this could happen. He watched what was happening in surprise. Margotia lay unconscious and motionless on the cold floor of the Lord's office. She woke up in her room and in her bed. The doctor said that this fainting spell was a consequence of overwork and nervous tension. Salvador was worried about his granddaughter. In fact, he was the reason for her poor health. But he was told that Margot just needed to get some sleep and everything would work out. The Lord was surprised that this fragile girl coped with his difficult tasks. In fact, Salvador believed that even if Margot had only mastered literacy in a week, It would already be a huge achievement for which he was going to praise her. The girl coughed in her sleep and said something. Salvador leaned closer and listened carefully. Margarita first snored, then sneezed and muttered something again. Lord Salvador only made out a few words. Strawberry, delicious, 1,000,000 gold, and please. Salvador understood everything immediately. He laughed. This girl was just like his granddaughter. It was obvious right away. The Lord stroked Margarita's head, and the girl opened her eyes. She was still weak and did not understand what had happened. Margosha asked where she was. Salvador replied that she had lost consciousness from lack of sleep. The Lord relaxed and began to resemble a loving grandfather. He said that Margot had worked hard and deserved encouragement. Salvador ordered that the girl be given access to his personal library, where she could borrow any books, whenever she wanted, and as many as she wanted. This was unexpected. Access to Salvador's personal library was only available to members of the Hart family. The butler was surprised. Even the young gentleman did not have such a privilege, but Margot was allowed this. The girl was delighted. This meant only one thing. She was accepted as a full member of the family, and now she too was a de Hart. Margarita's joy knew no bounds. She was finally recognized as one of her own, and this was done by the head of the family, the powerful and handsome Lord Salvador. Now Margarita had a name, a home, and a loving family. It was so great that she had managed to achieve everything in this life. The period when Margot, reborn as a 9-year-old commoner, worked in a seedy tavern is far behind her. Suddenly, Count Bernard de Hart appeared in her life and called himself her father, but in fact he was not. Margot and Bernard agreed to play the role of loving father and daughter in front of everyone, which was beneficial for both of them. In the de Hart family's home, survival is essential. To achieve this, Margot achieved recognition from the head of the family, Lord Salvador, and overcame the first obstacle to joining the family. Margarita was given a separate room so that she could diligently pursue her education. The girl thought that grandfather Salvador would start tormenting her with her studies again, but the formidable relative had not shown up for several days. One test was already over, but the problem was not yet solved, and it was unclear what to do next. Margarita was brought out of her reverie by a light touch of someone's gentle hand. The girl looked up to find Morticia and Ethan entering her room. Morticia invited Margarita to play hide-and-seek with them. It was the little girl's favorite game. Margot hadn't played hide-and-seek for a long time. Before her rebirth, she was too old for it. And after, she was busy surviving. After a whole day of hard work, there was no time for games. To get comfortable in the de Hart house, you need to make friends with the children, and there was no better way to do this than through games. Besides, Morticia was so sweet that Margarita simply could not refuse her. Margot told Ethan, who was standing there in confusion, that he should play with them, but the guy initially categorically refused. Margarita immediately declared him water, without listening to any of the guy's objections. Ethan had to close his eyes and slowly count to 60. The boy sighed heavily and agreed. Margarita admitted to herself that she enjoyed teasing Ethan. The inevitable question arose. Where could she hide now so that her cousin would not find her? Morticia hid behind the curtain, but the girl's legs were visible. It seemed she didn't understand that she would be discovered almost immediately. Margot didn't say anything to Morticia. She hoped that Ethan wouldn't upset the child right away, but would pretend that he was persistently searching. Margarita went to look for a secluded place for herself and ran into strangers in the corridor. They were a young man and an attractive young woman, and for them, meeting Margot was also a surprise. The girl became wary of these guests. She had never seen these people in the mansion before and had never heard of relatives of such an age. The man looked the girl over from head to toe, his face expressing bewilderment and curiosity. Margarita did not protest. In this house, she treated everyone correctly and was polite to the point of self-disgust. It dawned on the young man that this little girl with red eyes was the one about whom there had been so many rumors circulating in society lately. The guest's doubts were quickly dispelled. In front of him was the very same commoner that Madame Marianne had told him about. Margarita didn't understand who these people were, who were discussing her so unceremoniously. Had someone invited them to the mansion, and if so, for what purpose? The expression on both strangers' faces suddenly changed to one of contempt. The young man clarified that Margot would have to go to the head of the family again or something. The aristocrat stated that even if the girl enjoyed the favor of the head of the family, she should know her place. This was an outright provocation. Margarita often met such people both in her past life and after reincarnation. There was no point in arguing with them. It was just a waste of time and energy. So the girl simply got up from the floor and silently went about her business. The guests were outraged, called Margot impudent, and declared that she was completely ill-mannered. But nothing more could be expected from such a slob. Margarita did not deign to give these people either an answer or a glance. It was beneath her dignity. These people most likely suffered from lack of attention, both in childhood and now. Margot thought that being born into a noble family did not bring them happiness. Margarita's silence and complete disregard for her outraged the young people to the extreme. The girl stated that the young girl's insolence was beyond all bounds, and she intended to teach her a lesson. The guest snatched up the scabbard and decided to spank the naughty girl with it, declaring that she would not be able to complain because the bruises would not be visible. Margosha closed her eyes in fear and covered herself with her hands. She could no longer do anything to resist the brute force. A loud voice rang out, declaring that he would not tolerate insulting his family. It was Ethan. He demanded that she immediately move away from his sister. Margot was delighted. She was glad to hear Ethan say that those who raised a hand against a member of his family should be prepared to face the consequences of their actions. Ethan stated that the young men, although they were Marianne's watchdogs, did not understand that they were on neutral territory, and he was not going to forgive their behavior. After her cousin's appearance, Margarita no longer cared about these nobles. She saw something more important and exciting. The young aristocrats who had insulted her slowly retreated from the very young boy, who was half their age. The thing was that Ethan was enveloped in a powerful aura of the sword, and it was this aura that put pressure on the mental state of his opponents, forcing them to retreat from the battlefield. It was the sword aura, and Margarita was surprised to find that Ethan had mastered the art of controlling this phenomenon. Ethan listened calmly to the noble's statement that they were joking and stated that he accepted the apology, but did not absolve him of responsibility for insulting his sister. The young men decided that in this particular case, it would be best to flee. Ethan was too strong for them. The boy sighed with relief. The fact that the two had escaped was the best solution to the problem. Ethan asked if Margarita was okay and if she had any wounds or bruises. Margarita was filled with gratitude and appreciation, and she sincerely thanked her brother for his protection. The girl was worried that Ethan had to use the sword's aura to protect her, as at such a young age it could cause harm to her health. Ethan didn't understand what Margot was telling him. He doesn't know how to use the sword's aura yet. It turns out that he didn't even notice that he was using such a skillful ability. Margarita herself began to think that she had been mistaken and that she had not actually seen any aura of the sword. In fact, a small child could not have mastered such a skill. Ethan would not grow up to master the ball's aura until he was 15 years old, so Margot was most likely mistaken. Ethan was glad that everything ended peacefully and apologized to Margot for the offense. He could not even imagine that something like this could happen at his grandfather's residence. Margot asked her brother what neutral territory meant. They were talking about this mansion and the notorious battle for the inheritance. The DeHart family was different from ordinary noble families, which was cool, but it also created a whole bunch of problems. Ethan explained that the family possessed such wealth, influence, and power that it surpassed the ruling dynasty. It is only natural that many nobles would want to secure the support of the DeHart family. Grandfather never made concessions based on blood relationship. He made a point of accepting into the family only those who possessed outstanding abilities. For this reason, many of the aristocratic houses of the empire are subordinate to the DeHart family. To Margarita, all this reminded her more of a large criminal group than an aristocratic family. Only Margarita studied our own grandfather Salvador. It was quite in his spirit. Ethan could tell from Margot's expression that she was thinking something strange, and he told her that there were persistent rumors that her grandfather was planning to retire from political affairs. There are two contenders for the position of head of the family. The first is the eldest son of Salvador and Margot's father, Count Bernard Ruby DeHart. The second is Salvador's youngest son and Ethan's father, Count Edward DeHart. Grandfather's supporters split into two groups and are now secretly competing. It has gotten to the point that you can tell who supports whom just by the colors of their clothes. The conflict quickly escalated, and an unspoken but strict rule was established. The DeHart mansion was neutral territory, and duels were prohibited there. This was relevant and very important information. Margarita made her own conclusions. The girl asked why these two noblemen were so angry with her, She hadn't done anything bad to anyone. Ethan suggested that the incident was due to Margot's closeness to her grandfather, and that they were either jealous or considered her their enemy. The boy believed that, in any case, they were obliged to report what had happened to their grandfather as quickly as possible. But Margot had a different opinion and suggested that Ethan not tell his grandfather anything about it. Margarita promised to explain everything later, but for now she asked to keep what happened a secret. Ethan wanted to ask Margot more details, but suddenly remembered Martisha. Margot was worried. In their worries, they had completely forgotten about their younger sister. Suddenly, something happened to her. She could be offended by her brother and sister. Margarita remembered that the last time she saw the girl, she was hiding under the curtain and rushed into the room. There was no Morticia near the window. The boys were upset. They needed to keep a better eye on their little sister. There was a fear that the girl had been kidnapped by those two. Ethan was sure that the kidnappers could not have gone far. Margarita was nervous and worried about Morticia. Margarita and Ethan searched for their little sister all over the estate. They called the girl loudly, but it was all in vain. Margot was almost in tears. If those bastards wanted revenge, it would have been better if they had taken it out on her, and Martisha would have been in no danger. Ethan asked his sister not to blame herself in vain. Suddenly, the guy remembered something important and asked Margarita to follow him. Sometime later, Margot and Ethan were in Marguerite's bedroom, and there was something covered with a blanket on the bed. The children lifted the blanket and saw Morticia sleeping peacefully underneath it. She had waited so long to be found that she had fallen asleep. The children's joy knew no bounds. Their little sister was alive and well, but Margot couldn't understand how she could have ended up here if she was hiding behind the curtain in another room. Ethan explained that she often played in this room when Margot was away, apparently not waiting to be found, crawled under the covers, and fell asleep. Margot was pleased that Morticia had been waiting for her all this time, and she was glad that her sister was okay. A series of hugs followed, but Morticia couldn't understand why Margot's eyes were wet. Margarita praised her youngest for hiding so well and promised to always protect her. Ethan watched the sisters with a smile. It was so cool that they were all so close and friendly. In the evening, lying in bed, Margarita thought about the events of the day. It was surprising to realize that the reason for today's troubles was her rapprochement with the head of the family. Margarita considered this unfair. She was already embarrassed to see Salvador. Their very short relationship was enough to make someone jealous. Margot decided that she couldn't protect anyone if she just tried to win the family's favor. Morticia and Ethan were just children and could get into trouble. Margarita needed to find a way to become stronger in order to protect her brother and sister. Now they are her family. The girl used to think that when she became a noblewoman, she would live peacefully in prosperity and idleness. She was still so young, she wished she would grow up sooner. In the morning, Margarita had a fencing lesson with Uncle Edouard, after which the girl crawled barely alive. Margarita was about to change her clothes and start her textbooks when suddenly her plans changed dramatically. Margot met Lady Irene, Ethan's mother, and Lord Edward's wife. Beautiful, intelligent, and kind, this woman could not help but admire the girl. Irene asked how the training went and whether Margarita was very tired. Margarita wished the lady good morning, and Irene asked if she was free now. Margot replied that she was always free to help Lady Irene with whatever she could. Irene said that Ethan told her about the recent incident at the mansion, and she was sorry that everything happened this way. Madame offered the girl some tea. Only she, Margot, and Morticia. A treat as a sign of gratitude. Irene sent sweets, and she wants to share with Margot. Irene wanted to hear how Margarita lived outside the mansion, and how the quarrelsome offspring of the nobility pestered her. Margarita was determined to accept the offer. There was no reason to refuse if a family member made the first move. In addition, Margot wanted to discuss in more detail the reasons for the hostility towards her on the part of some aristocrats. Irene was glad that Margarita accepted her invitation, and the girl decided to ask her who Marianne was. She had heard that name somewhere before. Madame invited Margot to one of the remote but very cozy corners of the estate and offered to drink tea before starting the conversation. The tea was delicious, the sweets were excellent, and the atmosphere was conducive to intimate conversation. Morticia was having fun nearby, and Irene and Margarita could talk freely without fear of being overheard. Margarita relaxed. It was pleasant to be in such a wonderful place, especially at Lady Irene's invitation. Lady Irene liked Margot's attitude and boasted that she had made the swings and slide for this place herself. Margarita could only admire Lady Irene's skill and her unexpected ability. The girl's praise brought Lady Irene into complete delight. She was glad to have found a like-minded person in her. Few of her aristocratic acquaintances encouraged her love of making handicrafts and furniture from wood. They did not understand her at all. Margarita admitted that she liked this corner that Lady Irene had created. It was incredibly cozy. Lady Irene listened with pleasure to Margaret's comments on her efforts. The girl said that Irene's soul can be felt in everything here, in every blade of grass, every flower. How could anyone not like such a garden? Lady Irene announced that in that case, Margarita could come here to play or relax at any time. The young woman and the little girl quickly found a common language and became close. They were simply kindred spirits. Lady Irene suggested starting tea. She had heard that Margarita loved sweets and offered the girl several new desserts for tea. Margarita tried the first piece and soared to the heavens from the unearthly taste. Lady Irene had no doubt that her desserts would make just such an impression on her new friend. The lady said that usually Margot seems mature beyond her years. But when she eats treats, it's immediately clear that Margosha is just a child. Margot asked if she had a strange expression on her face when she ate. Irene replied that it was not strange, but rather delighted. Lady Irene believed that only children can admire the taste of desserts in this way. Adults cannot do so. Margarita didn't like at all that desserts had such a stupefying effect on her. She considered herself quite grown up. Lady Irene did not agree with Margot. Her attitude towards sweets was incredibly sweet. Margarita must have some weaknesses too. Margarita decided that she had to learn to control her emotions so as not to appear too naive in public. Lady Irene reminded her that Margarita would soon be making her social debut and offered to be her guide through aristocratic life. Margarita was delighted at the opportunity to learn more about the intrigues of the aristocrats and asked who Marianne was. Suddenly, a shadow passed over Lady Irene's face. The woman cowered and looked around, as if afraid that they would be overheard. Margarita was even confused. Had she really said or done something that upset Madame Irene? This was the first time Margarita had seen such an expression on Mrs. Irene's face. The lady told her that Marianne was a dangerous person and that she had tried to kill Ethan. The world seemed to have darkened. The rich were fighting for a place in the sun no less cruelly than the poor. This was not a revelation for Margot, but there was little pleasant about it either. Margaret knew that Marianne Ashford, the Duchess of Ashford, came from the minor gentry, but married a duke, and her status soared. Shortly after the wedding, the Duke of Ashford died, and it was said that his young wife was involved in his death. But there was no evidence, and Marianne was found innocent. This situation was widely discussed in the Empire. Even the worker of a seedy inn heard these rumors. So Margot knew something about Marianne. Irene suspected that Margot might have heard of Marianne before. This woman is so strange that everyone tries to stay away from her. The most dangerous thing, in Irene's opinion, was that the Duchess of Ashford was now obsessed with Margot's grandfather, Lord Salvador. Watching Morticia, Margot realized that the obsession of a woman who had previously been accused, even falsely, of someone was, at the very least, strange. But maybe she had fallen in love. It was suspicious. But how does this relate to the assassination attempt on Ethan? If Marianne loves or respects Salvador, then she must protect his heir and grandson. Irene replied that before Margot came into the family, Salvador had placed all his hopes for the future of the Hart family on Ethan alone, although the boy did not know it. Margarita suggested that Marianne wanted to get rid of everyone Salvador paid attention to. Irene replied that Margot was unusually quick-witted and understood everything quickly, and the lady had no doubt about it. Salvador never made concessions just because of blood ties, so Ethan, his beloved grandson, had to work hard to earn his grandfather's recognition. One day during a banquet, a large vase fell right on Ethan, which could have been considered an accident. Only Marianne and her retinue were also at this banquet, but she did not arouse anyone's suspicions. That incident was written off as an accident. But then there were other incidents. Margarita was surprised that this woman really acts so carefully that she doesn't leave any evidence, or that no one wants to contact her and look for this evidence. Irene was sure that all attempts on Ethan's life were the work of the Duchess. The lady was sure of this. Marianne herself did not like her either, but she did not make any attempts to eliminate her, only because Irene was not Salvador's favorite. Irene was afraid for Margot. She asked the girl to promise her that she would avoid meeting with Marianne. Otherwise, the girl could be in danger. Irene tried to convince Margot not to show any interest in Marianne, that it would be best to ignore her. The girl hesitated, but decided to take this information into account. Margarita thought, perhaps she had behaved carelessly when meeting with Marianne's people. She should have been more friendly. It was getting dark. Irene decided that it was time for them to return to the mansion, and while standing near the door, Margot and Irene heard a strange commotion in the house. Lady Irene asked one of the maids what was going on in the mansion and why there was such a commotion. Before the girl could answer, the Duchess of Ashford herself appeared before Irene. Lady Irene was indignant. It was an unheard of impudence to arrive at the Hart mansion so late and without warning. Margarita carefully examined the uninvited guest. This was the same Duchess they had just spoken about in the garden. Margot thought the woman would look intimidating, but Marianne seemed sweet, and Irene told the Duchess that it was bad form to show up unannounced. Marianne was sweet and kind, and said she had only come to apologize to Lady Margaret. As soon as the Duchess heard that her people had behaved with the utmost impoliteness and tactlessness towards this sweet young lady, she hastened to offer her apologies. Marianne immediately glanced at Margot and said that she wanted to offer her deepest apologies and, as a sign of reconciliation, wanted to present her with a rare fruit. Margarita appreciated the gift. The fruit was truly rare and very tasty. And what's more, the girl was simply crazy about it. The Duchess apologized for her servants. They apparently misunderstood something. Marianne took strict measures to ensure that something like this did not happen again. Irene asked ironically if Marianne was sure that everything that had happened had not been planned. Marianne noted that Lady Irene was still the same and haughty with her. The Duchess claimed that the incident with Ethan was a misunderstanding. Marianne was well aware of the rumors being spread about her and why Irene did not want to trust her. The Duchess regretted that all her efforts to persuade Lady Irene and establish relations with her were shattered on the ice of her prejudice. Marianne insisted that Margot accept her apology and gift, but the girl was at a loss. In direct communication, Marianne's intentions were difficult to understand. Margot found it difficult to determine whether this woman was a cunning schemer or whether her intentions were truly pure and all the events were fatal accidents. Irene answered for Margot that they accepted the gift and the apology, but now Marianne had to leave. The Duchess replied that she still had business at the mansion. Marianne cannot leave until she speaks with the head of the family, Lord Salvador, about his assignment and clarifies when he will return. To Irene's indignation, it turned out that Salvador would only return in the morning, and until then, the Duchess planned to stay in the mansion. Lady Irene demanded that Marianne come tomorrow, but the Duchess said that the order came from the Emperor, so she would stay here to wait for Salvador. Irene sent Margot to bed and ordered the servants to keep a close eye on the Duchess of Ashford and her people. Margarita decided not to strain herself and leave everything to Lady Irene. The girl retired to her room to think everything over carefully. It was worth admitting that everything in this situation was unclear and confusing. At first glance, Duchess Marianne could not be considered a villain. What if this is the case when what is happening is a misunderstanding and a chain of accidents? The maid helped Margarita get ready for bed and wished the girl good night. Margarita enjoyed talking to this maid. Leah was sweet and polite. The girl said goodnight to the girl and remained in the room alone. Margot was just about to fall asleep when she heard footsteps at her door. The girl became alarmed and asked loudly who wanted to enter her room and why. It was quiet, and Margarita decided that she had misheard. Just in case, the girl got up and went to the door to check if there was anyone behind it. The door creaked softly and opened slightly, and a beam from a night lamp burst into the room. There was still a visitor, and the last thing Margarita expected was to see this woman in her room. Standing in the doorway was the Duchess of Ashford herself, in all her splendor. Margarita froze from surprise and a sticky feeling of fear. White and fluffy ones don't appear in other people's rooms at night without an invitation. The Duchess looked around and unceremoniously announced that she had finally found Marguerite's room and found her apartments to be cozy. Margot was perplexed as to what Madame Marianne had forgotten in her room and what she wanted. The woman apologized for scaring Margot. She was just looking for the reception area, but the estate was huge and she got lost. Margarita replied that everything was fine. It turned out that Marianne had simply gone to the wrong door. That could very well have happened. The Duchess asked the girl to tell her how to get to the reception area of her grandfather Salvador's office. Margarita explained that when her ladyship left the room, she simply had to go straight down the corridor and turn left at the end. where the reception room would be. The Duchess understood everything, thanked the girl for her help, and asked for forgiveness for intruding at such a late hour. Margot replied that nothing terrible had happened. Her Highness simply needed to return to the reception room and wait for her grandfather there. At first, Marianne seemed frightening to Margot, but now she no longer seemed angry. She asked if the girl had settled into the estate. Margot replied that everyone was taking care of her, and she was getting used to things quickly. Grandfather Salvador was kind to her and allowed her to visit his personal office and library. Marianne knew very well that the library and study were the holy of holies of El Salvador, and not everyone was allowed to enter there. The Duchess considered this the highest sign of trust. Even she was not allowed to enter Salvador's office. Marianne grabbed Margot tightly by the chin and said with fury in her voice that she was interested to know how Margarita had captured Lord Salvador's heart. Margarita felt awkward and a little hurt, and she asked again what Lady Marianne meant. By this time, the Duchess had already mastered her anger and declared that she was just joking. Margarita was slightly taken aback. She silently nodded at the Duchess's announcement that it was time to leave and her wish for good night. There was something wrong with this woman. Her expression changed as soon as the conversation turned to her grandfather and his attitude towards Margarita. Lady Irene's words came to mind, that the Duchess was simply obsessed with Salvador, and it was because of this person that Ethan almost died. The disappointing conclusion was that if Lady Irene was right, then the next target after Ethan was Margarita. After this visit, everything fell into place. Now Margot had to find out what Marianne needed, and this needed to be done before her family got into a dangerous situation. The morning could hardly be called good. Margarita woke up with a sore head and a heavy heart. The girl did not close her eyes that night. The anxiety left by the Duchess's visit did not leave her. Marianne's words echoed in her head about how she was interested in learning the secret of how Margot managed to capture Lord Salvador's heart, and why she told Margarita this. Margosha couldn't understand this woman. It turned out that she was still a villain, but not such a cunning one, or she underestimated Margot as an enemy. Near the dining room, Margarita discovered a whole flock of servants discussing the Duchess's insolent behavior. Margot heard the girls calling Marianne shameless and worried that she might poison the master's food. The girl entered the dining room and saw that the servants were more than right. Marianne had the audacity to sit at the Deshart family's dining table. The Duchess took one of the seats, despite the fact that no one had invited her, and knowing full well that only members of the Deshart family ate there. The maids whispered that this woman was studying the properties and effects of various poisons. Marianne studied old potions, created new ones, and tested poisons and antidotes on people. It was said that her late husband was completely healthy before marrying her and had no complaints. After the wedding, the Duke lived happily, but not for long. He died suddenly from an unknown illness. The servants assumed that this witch had probably killed him. The shadow of her husband's death, not as young and healthy as they said, lay on Marianne, too beautiful and young to be sinless. This story was circulating everywhere, and everyone knew it, saying that Marianne was a hunter for wealthy men. There were rumors that she had already squandered her late husband's vast fortune and was now setting her sights on Lord Salvador and his money. Margarita wondered if there was even a little truth in this story. For example, that the Duchess wanted to conquer her grandfather. Then her behavior yesterday was understandable. Margot wondered if Grandfather Salvador knew that such rumors were circulating about Duchess Marianne. If Lord Salvador knows all this, then why doesn't he drive the Duchess away, but keeps her close to him and is so kind to this woman? Salvador heard footsteps and was distracted from exchanging compliments with Marianne. It was clear that he enjoyed the company of this lady. Margarita stood at a loss in the doorway of the dining room, not knowing what to do next: go inside and join in, or leave before she was seen. While Margot was thinking, it was too late. Salvador saw his granddaughter and asked what she was doing there. Margarita explained that she was passing by, saw her grandfather, and decided to say hello to him. Salvador was in high spirits. He asked Margot if she had had breakfast and invited her to join him and the Duchess. Lord Salvador sat the girl on his lap and ordered her to place the cutlery next to his plate. Margarita could not understand how it all happened. She overheard the maid's conversation and caught her grandfather's eye and was now sitting on his lap at the dinner table. Salvador introduced Margaret as his granddaughter and Bernard's daughter to the Duchess of Ashford. Marianne was incredibly sweet, but said that she had already met this sweet little lady yesterday. Salvador was glad that Margot and Marianne were already acquainted. The girl politely greeted the Duchess. Margarita was a big enough girl to eat lunch in her grandfather's arms, and she was seated next to him. Salvador immediately offered his granddaughter her favorite dishes. The girl was overwhelmed with care. Her grandfather offered her meat dishes, declaring that she loved them, and then offered to bring her a strawberry dessert. Margot was a little confused. Salvador was behaving strangely. He was too smiling and friendly. Marianne watched her grandfather and granddaughter, and under her gaze, Margot felt the same sticky fear as yesterday. Margot asked her grandfather to stop. She said that yesterday she had not really met Her Highness. The girl asked her grandfather for permission to move closer to the Duchess and talk to her. Margot did this because she decided that she would have to find out why this woman was afraid of her and at the same time was hanging around Salvador. The girl approached the Duchess of Ashford and introduced herself as Lord Salvador's granddaughter, Lady Margaret. Duchess Marianne smiled sweetly and said that she was very glad to meet such a charming girl. Margot decided to conduct reconnaissance in force and said that yesterday, when Her Grace came to her room late at night, she did not have time to greet her as expected. Salvador was surprised why Lady Marianne went into Margot's room late at night. The Duchess replied that she had mixed up the rooms. Margarita continued to be surprised with childish innocence by Marianne's strange behavior the previous night. The girl said that the Duchess, for no apparent reason, grabbed her painfully by the face and then looked at her coldly as if she wanted to kill her and terribly frightened her. Marianne looked confused, as if she hadn't expected the girl to be so frank. Horror flashed in the Duchess's eyes. Never had Sterlitz been so close to failure. Salvador could not help but pay attention to Margarita's story and was greatly discouraged. Margot came to the conclusion that there was no need to test the waters any further. It was necessary to act directly. Beating around the bush would only make things worse. She had to show Salvador the true face of Marianne, the schemer and poisoner. Margot then enlists the support of the most influential person in the house and gets rid of the insidious Duchess. At this point in time, this plan seemed to Margarita to be the most reliable and effective. The picture of the world had already completely fallen into place, and the puzzle pieces had come together. It was only a little while before the final defeat of the enemy, but suddenly Lord Salvador laughed loudly and infectiously, which, in his words, was too much. Lord Salvador asked the Duchess if Marianne had behaved with Margarita in exactly the same way as she had with him. Salvador remembered that Marianne had behaved in exactly the same way when they first met. He had thought she was strange and had almost dealt with her on the spot. The Lord remembered that Marianne had bumped into him in the corridor of the Imperial Palace, stared at him without saying hello, and then burst out laughing. Very soon after they met, Salvador realized that this was the Duchess's way of showing her sympathy for the man. Marianne felt awkward. The woman justified her behavior by the influence of the medications she works with. The fumes enter Marianne's respiratory tract, and she behaves strangely. The Duchess claimed that she does not conduct experiments on people or animals. Margarita was confused. It turned out that Salvador trusted Marianne much more than the girl expected. But she was definitely up to something. Margosha asked what Marianne used all her potions for. Marianne wanted to answer, but started coughing. Salvador asked what was wrong with her. The Duchess replied that she had hardly slept while waiting for him, and therefore she was slightly sick from fatigue. The Lord immediately decided that she should rest for now. Mariana promised to tell her everything later and quickly left the dining room, either because she really felt ill or because she decided to avoid an unpleasant conversation. Margarita looked at the Duchess with a hopeless expression. She had beaten her, but this was not the last round. As she left, the Duchess dared to cast a warning glance at the girl, and all this in the presence of Lord Salvador. Mariana's whole demeanor showed that Margarita had greatly upset her, and she would not let it go. The granddaughter and grandfather were left alone at the table. Salvador asked if Margot had also heard rumors about Marianne. The girl answered in the affirmative. Salvador told his granddaughter that Marianne was an unsociable person, probably because she was constantly sitting in the workshop and preparing various potions. The Lord believed that this was why many people had the wrong impression of her. The girl drew her grandfather's attention to the rumors about this woman. Salvador believed that the rumors that Marianne was a poisoner were nonsense. If she had managed to prepare a poison that left no trace, he would have given up his post to her long ago. The grandfather told his granddaughter that he knew the Duke of Ashford well. He was not attentive to his health, drank a lot, ate sweets, and loved to have fun. His death was a matter of time. Salvador considered Marianne a gifted individual, and his grandfather stated that if she had actually killed the Duke to take his place, he would not have cared. Margot was stunned. Her grandfather said that he simply needed talented people among his comrades, and the rest did not matter. Marianne was the victim of idle gossip and envious people, and did not pose any danger to the DeHart family. What her grandfather said puzzled Margarita. It turned out that she had worried in vain and accused an innocent man. As Salvador said, the talk about the Duchess was just gossip, and Margot was judging a person based on distorted rumors. The girl felt awkward and remembered her very recent past, when she, too, was a victim of idle gossip. The neighboring children refused to play or communicate with her, and treated her cruelly and with prejudice. They bullied Margotia even when she was walking past on her master's orders, and had no intention of approaching them. It all happened because the mother of one of the children said that Margotia from the inn was a thief. Margarita stated that all this was nonsense and gossip. She had never taken anything from anyone else in her life. They didn't want to listen to the girl. They didn't take her excuses into account and drove her away. The children teased Margotia as a thief, struck her from behind, and then immediately hurried to run away, repeating that Margotia was a thief. The girl was sad. She really didn't steal anything. Why didn't anyone believe her? The analogy was obvious, but it was undeniable that the Duchess was behaving suspiciously. Margarita again witnessed a conversation between servants. One of the girls called the Duchess a witch and asked where she was now, while the other replied that she was in the guest room. The maid claimed that the Duchess was feigning ill health in order to stay longer at the DeHart mansion. The maids couldn't understand why Marianne didn't leave. She wasn't from a noble family, but she had climbed so high. The girls whispered that everything was simple. The Duchess was just a witch if she could drive her husband out of this world and remain a rich widow, and she also gambled. Margarita was surprised that everyone was speaking so badly about the Duchess, without even bothering to find out whether it was true or not. It was so similar to how people treated her before. Even though Marianne was acting suspiciously, whispering behind her back was low. Moreover, since the maids went so far as to accuse Marianne of stealing, Margot did not listen any longer, but asked the girls if they had seen it themselves. The maids did not expect to find that the young mistress was listening to their chatter. Margot inquired whether the girls had seen with their own eyes how the Duchess was stealing, whether perhaps something had gone missing from them immediately after her visit, but they answered that this had not happened. Margarita was indignant. If there is no compelling evidence, then it is low to suspect a person. Rumors become increasingly absurd if they are passed on by word of mouth. Margot reminded the girls that they were part of the DeHart household and should be careful in their words, and the maids apologized and hurried away. The girl did not notice that the Duchess of Ashford herself witnessed this scene. That night, Margot tossed and turned in her bed again, wondering why she had stood up for Duchess Marianne's honor. This woman did indeed arouse suspicion, but she reminded Margarita too much of her recent past. Looking at Marianne, the girl remembered her former self when sidelong glances and unfair accusations made her unconsciously bare her sharp fangs. Her thoughts were confused, and the girl was sinking deeper and deeper into a deep sleep, even too deep. Margot was brought back to her waking state by the sensation of numb lips, and then hands. She did not understand what was happening to her. Margarita woke up tied, hand and foot, in a small confined space. It was some kind of wooden box, and it was shaking and jumping all the time, creating additional discomfort and inconvenience for the girl. Margot didn't understand what was happening, but she realized that she was being taken somewhere tied up in a wooden cart along an uneven road. Margarita didn't feel her numb body at all. Could she really have been kidnapped? She thought nervously. The girl had definitely fallen asleep in her own bed. After a long shaking, the cart stopped and two strangers of bandit appearance pulled down the curtain and pulled the girl out of the box. Margarita could not understand how these two could get into her bedroom. Her grandfather's mansion was famous for its reliable security. Various hypotheses crowded around in Margotia's head, but one thing was clear. This was the work of a person close to the DeHart family. The bandits untied the girl's mouth. Margot winced and immediately began asking questions. The first thing the girl asked was who ordered her to be brought here, and promised that this person would pay for his actions. Margarita screamed that her grandfather would start looking for her and figure out who ordered it in no time. One of the kidnappers tied the girl up again and ordered her to sit quietly. The customer would soon show up there himself. The bandits mocked her. They said that if Margarita wanted to live a little longer, she had to behave perfectly. The girl realized that these people were not joking. They were really going to kill her. But who would need it? Who would be capable of such baseness? Footsteps were heard on the street. The door creaked. The bandit looked around in fear, and from his appearance, it was clear that the one he was waiting for had arrived. Margarita saw a female silhouette and unmistakably identified it as Duchess Marianne Ashford. The woman walked decisively towards the girl and threw back the hood of her cloak. The Duchess's violet gaze pierced right through her. She abandoned pretense and was completely consumed with hatred for Margarita. The girl almost believed that Marianne was not a villain, so her appearance here and now shocked Margot. Lord Salvador was reading in his study, finding it difficult to concentrate, his thoughts constantly returning to his granddaughter. Margarita firmly entered the heart of an elderly man. The girl was smart and developed beyond her years. The girl was expected to grow up not only smart, but also beautiful. The Lord was confident that she would become the pride of the DeHart family. Salvador hoped that Margot and Marianne would find common ground. The Duchess was increasingly captivating the man, and he was already thinking about marrying her. The Lord didn't understand one thing: why the rumors surrounding the Duchess were spreading with renewed vigor. In principle, it wasn't that important. It was difficult to impress Marianne with such things. Guard DeHart soldiers ran into the room. The guys were incredibly alarmed. Salvador jumped up and asked what kind of commotion they were causing. The security commander announced that young Mrs. Margarita had gone missing. The maid, Leah, had put the girl to bed, but when she later checked on the child, she did not find her in the room. The Lord was at a loss as to where his precious granddaughter could have disappeared from the carefully guarded palace. The guards reported that one of the maids saw a suspicious cart leaving the estate late at night. Salvador announced that he knew what had happened and ordered that his horse be saddled immediately. The Lord was determined to save Margarita. The girl had entrusted her life to him, and he could not leave her in trouble. At this time, Margarita looked into Marianne's eyes and asked the woman why and for what purpose she did this. What bad thing Margot did to her? The Duchess replied that Margarita should not act like a fool. She understood perfectly well that this was all because Salvador was smiling at Margot. Margosha couldn't find words to express her indignation. The girl even stopped being afraid from surprise. It was only because of this that they wanted to kill her. The Duchess looked possessed. She said that Margaret could not understand what Lord Salvador DeHart meant to her. When everyone avoided Marianne just because she was involved in potion making, only Salvador treated her like a human being. This man calmed Marianne and extended a helping hand to her, rescuing her from trouble when she was groundlessly accused of her husband's death. Salvador was the center of the world for Marianne, her hope, her main and only love in her life. He is the smartest, the most handsome, the kindest, and most gentle. Marianne considered this man her god. But Margot came and took Lord Salvador away from her. Margarita tried to convince the Duchess. She was talking nonsense. Salvador loves Margot like a granddaughter, and Marianne as a friend, or maybe even more. The Duchess did not respond to the arguments of reason. She shouted at Margarita to keep quiet, not to dare open her mouth and make excuses. The crazy woman screamed that she had seen everything with her own eyes, and that Margot would pay with her life for her actions. Marianne believed that the problem was precisely that the girl dared to attract the attention of Lord Salvador, and that this was her greatest fault. The Duchess did not intend to explain anything else, and did not want to listen to anything. She gave the order to her servants to get rid of Margarita. Margot resisted and shouted that the Duchess was mad if she was going to kill an innocent child over such a trivial matter. Things were bad, and Margosha had no help to expect from anyone. The only way to save herself was to convince Marianne. The girl asked the Duchess if she was going to continue to get rid of everyone who aroused Lord Salvador's sympathy. Margarita screamed that her disappearance would not make Mr. Salvador fall in love with Duchess Marianne. The woman stopped. Something clicked in her sick brain, and she fell into a rage. Marianne drew her sword and rushed at Margot. How dare she say such a thing? Lord Salvador represents the whole world to her. The Duchess apparently intended to deal with her rival personally and put a sharp blade to the girl's throat. Marianne screamed that in this nightmare life, only Salvador does not look at her with condemnation. The world collapses when the Lord turns away from her. Margarita even felt sorry for this woman. She was so desperately lonely that the only person who was kind to her became the focus of her affection. The Duchess continued to rage and promised to eliminate anyone who came close to Salvador. The woman declared that anyone who dared to stand between her and her love would die. Pity overcame fear, and Margot told the Duchess that she should stop, look at her behavior, and think about why people were so prejudiced against her. Mariana replied that this is because people judge a person only by their appearance. This was indeed confirmed by Margot. But in reality, the Duchess is not like that. The girl herself initially believed the rumors and thought badly of Marianne, but now she believes her. Margarita begged the Duchess to stop before it was too late. Did she really think that her grandfather would really want to see her in the role of a killer? Margot said that if Marianne stopped right now, everything could still be fixed. Marianne noticed the girl's big red eyes. They were exactly like Lord Salvador's. The woman became hysterical and screamed that no matter what the girl looked at her with Salvador's eyes, she did not dare do that. Marguerite tried to convince Marianne of the futility of her actions, but the Duchess no longer listened to her. The woman screamed at Margot to shut up and swung her sword at her. Margot didn't expect that mentioning Salvador would only make the situation worse. The Duchess was sure that as soon as Margarita was gone, everything would return to its place, and she would again be the most beloved and needed in Salvador's life. Margarita cowered in anticipation of the blow. It would have been stupid to die like that. But apparently the gods didn't want to see the girl happy. The front door swung open with a loud bang, letting a bright ray of sunlight into the semi-darkness of the utility room, and Lord Salvador appeared on the threshold along with the sun. Marianne did not expect his lordship to appear, and Margarita expected it even less. The sword, already ready to fall on the poor child's head, hung in the air. Marianne did not dare to deliver the fatal blow in the presence of Lord Salvador. Lord Salvador looked at the picture before him with indignation and outrage. He did not understand what all this meant. Salvador, the head of the Hart family, felt bitter and hurt. How could Marianne dare to commit such blasphemy? Despite all the good attitude towards her, he could not forgive this. Lady Marianne had nothing to say in her defense. The nervous excitement had left her, leaving only emptiness and regret instead. Salvador was categorical. His granddaughter's enemy was the enemy of the entire Hart family, and such people should not be left alive. Margot realized that because of her, one person was about to take the life of another, and loudly demanded that her grandfather stop. The girl rushed towards Salvador and hugged him tightly, ignoring his demand that she move away and not interfere. Margarita declared the whole incident a monstrous misunderstanding and declared that Lady Marianne had not wanted to kill her at all. Marianne stood in the middle of the room. She didn't really understand what was happening and only nodded, agreeing with Margot. Lord Salvador asked his granddaughter to explain why Margarita was drawing such conclusions, although he had just witnessed something completely different. Margot explained that if Lady Marianne had planned murder, she would have carried out her plan long ago. Margarita saw that the lady did not dare to deal the fatal blow, and when Marianne spoke to Margot, tears rolled down her cheeks. The girl demanded that Marianne confirm that she was right. The lady had no intention of killing Salvador's granddaughter. Lord Salvador was indignant. How could Margot say such a thing? He had just pulled her out from under Lady Marianne's sword. Margarita said that she, too, is familiar with the feeling when no one wants to believe a person, despite his innocence. The girl remembered how, almost breaking under the weight of accusations, she had already decided to admit that she was a thief. Margarita thought that then they would leave her alone and would not harass or pester her. It's good that she realized then that admitting false guilt would not solve the problem, but would only make the situation worse. The girl remembered how, just recently, the innocent Marianne had been accused of theft by the maids. Even though nothing had gone missing in the house, Margarita then scolded the maids. She was disgusted when an innocent person was condemned because of rumors and gossip. That is, Margarita said that she understood Margaret's condition and was not at all angry with the lady. The girl suggested to the woman that they make peace and not hold grudges and anger against each other. Marianne cried. No one ever understood her. Salvador always supported her, but he could not express the feelings that tormented her as fully as Margot did. The woman Margarita was against the murder. She wanted Marianne not to stand there like a submissive lamb, but to try to justify herself and convince Salvador of her innocence. But Marianne was depressed and ready to atone for her intentions by any means. Lord Salvador asked the woman if she had foreseen the consequences of her actions. Such an act could not be atoned for with a lesser punishment. Margot clenched her fists in frustration, but she had to convince Lord Salvador of Marianne's innocence. However, the girl decided that great efforts would not be required. Salvador had already spoken of what had happened as a momentary confusion. Margot's words convinced the man. Lord Cervantes declared that since his granddaughter Margarita believed Lady Marianne, he himself believed her, but asked her not to disappoint him again. Marianne wept. Her temporary confusion passed, and she was amazed at the generosity of Lord Salvador and his granddaughter. Margarita was happy that everything ended well, and Lord Salvador felt sympathy for Marianne. A faint hope dawned on Margot that Salvador was much more humane than she had assumed. Lord Salvador did not punish Lady Marianne here and now. Punishment awaited her ahead. Now he took his granddaughter Margot in his arms and decided to go home. Marianne went out to see Lord Salvador off and watched for a long time after the horse was leaving. The anxiety and tension of the last few days had left her completely, and her soul felt calm and quiet. Marianne, the lady, watched with what tenderness Lord Salvador communicated with his granddaughter, and no longer felt the all-consuming anger and jealousy that had accompanied her before. Quite a long time passed after the incident with Lady Marianne. Everything went on as usual, only Margot was showered with gifts. Every morning, the maid entered Margarita's bedroom with the message that the young lady had received another parcel. There were not just a lot of gifts, but a lot. Margarita's room was completely littered with unopened boxes. Margot, the maid, wasn't happy with the latest trinket either. All these gifts had been sent by Lady Marianne, and the girl simply couldn't imagine where to put it all. Ever since the kidnapping incident, despite the ban, Lady Marianne sent gifts for Margot every day. The maid handed Margarita a box and told her that she had been told that this gift was special and that they sincerely asked her to accept it. Intrigue. Contrasting with the white silk of the napkin, a dazzling red ruby lay in the box. The maid sighed in admiration. The stone was the same color as the young lady's eyes. The gift was striking in its luxury and splendor, and clearly had a double meaning. Margot, the girl hoped that this wonderful ruby was a sign that the flow of gifts was ending. Overall, Margarita was pleased with herself. She had managed not only to save herself, but also to secure the support of one of the most powerful aristocrats in the empire. This gave hope that Margarita would be able to build a happy life for herself this time. Everything on her way. Ethan's father lay face down, his arms spread out helplessly, a bloodstain slowly spreading beneath his face. To say little, but the girl still didn't know what to do. Today was the harvest festival, and there was no one in the mansion. She herself was not able to help Edward. And if he died, then what? Edward stood up and sat down, staring at Margarita with a dull, absent-minded gaze. He clearly did not recognize the girl and did not seem to understand what was happening to him. Confirming Margot's guess, Edward immediately asked who she was and what she was doing there. Margarita had only recently arrived at the mansion, but she and Edward dined at the same table every day, so in a normal state, he would have recognized her. For a few seconds, Edward and Margot looked at each other in confusion. Then the haze in the man's eyes began to disappear, and he remembered that it was his brother's daughter in front of him. Margarita was once again amazed by the cold-bloodedness of the Hart family. They paid no attention not only to others' wounds, but also to their own, and this is where she needed to live. Margot explained that the day before she had run into his father in the hallway, he was covered in blood, but looked completely unperturbed. Margarita immediately noted to herself that although Ethan was Edward's son, they had completely different characters. Ethan was kind to the people around him, while Edward was cruel and indifferent. To be honest, Edward is just a war-obsessed maniac who doesn't give a damn about those around him. Ethan, the boy knew perfectly well that when the time came, Salvador could become cruel, and his father had simply inherited this trait. The girl handed Ethan her favorite treat, a sprig of reed. But after Margot forced the treat into his mouth, the boy's opinion changed. It turned out that even simple food could be tasty. The girl was looking forward to an interesting walk. She said goodbye to the maid and intended to spend the day wisely and with pleasure. First, on the way, Margarita asked if everything was okay with Morticia, or if she wanted Margot to do something for her. The girl, Morticia was a weak and sickly girl from birth, and was never allowed to leave the mansion. Margarita was persistent. She declared that Morticia would go for a walk with her, and that this was not up for discussion. In response, Salvador was convinced that his youngest granddaughter was absolutely not allowed to walk such a long distance. The head of Margarita asked her grandfather to stop. She said that, in general, she agreed with him, but recently she had studied several interesting books. Maybe Salvador was intrigued and confused by the connection between Morticia's walk and the content of the books Margot had read. Margarita replied that if Grandpa would let Morticia go with her and Ethan, then all three of them would show him their successes. Margot announced to Salvador that she could sing and dance, and that she didn't often get the chance to perform in front of an audience, but she was willing to try for her grandfather's sake. Margarita was incredibly sweet and convincing, and Grandfather Salvador's loving heart wavered. Lord Salvador looked at his grandchildren for a long time, weighing the pros and cons, the silence dragging on. Margarita began to fear that instead of going for a walk, they would all be locked in their rooms. Had she overestimated her influence on her grandfather? Suddenly, Lord Salvador laughed loudly. The all-powerful head of the DeHart family laughed long and loudly, so that tears flowed from his eyes. The children looked at their grandfather attentively. Even Ethan didn't remember his grandfather laughing so merrily. Having laughed his fill, Salvador declared that Margarita was about to blurt out some incredibly stupid thing, and that he was in for an interesting performance. Grandfather said that he would allow Morticia to go for a walk, but they must travel in a carriage with a berth, take 7 servants and the headmaid with them. Margarita was surprised why there were so many servants. Ethan was traveling with them, and you couldn't wish for a better guard than him. Margot was tormented by doubts, but her grandfather agreed so quickly, as if he had been waiting for her to suggest something like this, as if he had been planning to let her go from the very beginning. Margarita asked Grandfather Salvador directly. He had no intention of refusing them. Wasn't that so? Salvador did not answer directly, but ordered the children to get ready quickly. The day was short, and they would not have time to have fun properly. The children didn't argue with their grandfather. All three quickly went to get ready for a walk. No one wanted to tempt fate and wait for their grandfather to change his mind. Soon Ethan, Margot, and Morticia arrived at the main street, where the best shops and entertainment of the capital were concentrated. They had to decide where they would go first, to enjoy some tasty treats, ride the carousel, or go on a grand shopping spree. When Margarita lived at the inn, she couldn't stand this street. The goods here were beautiful, desirable, and inaccessible to her because of their high cost. There was everything here: toys, clothes, jewelry. The girl wanted to look at them, but she was always thrown out of the shops, considered a thief or a beggar. But now everything was completely different. With her grandfather's fortune, Margarita could buy out any shop on this street, and not just one. Ethan was delighted by Margot's enthusiastic mood. The boy set his sights on the shop where they sold sugarcane and seemed determined to buy up everything there. Margarita thought Ethan was buying too much. The mansion was already full of sugarcane. The girl's eye caught the sign of a famous capital shop where absolutely everything was sold, from the most unnecessary trinkets to rare books and furniture. Margarita decided that they all had to visit this shop and maybe even buy something there. The girl rushed into the shop. There were a lot of lovely things there, and Lord DeHart's grandchildren were welcome visitors. Margot wanted to buy a lot of things, and she did not deny herself anything. Ethan did not stop her. One of the girl's main acquisitions was a magnificent music box, something Margot could never have dreamed of before. All the purchases were packed and handed to Margarita. She was simply glowing with happiness and full of love for the whole world. In the depths of Margot's subconscious, the thought was creeping in that she had gotten too carried away. But the girl brushed it off. She had been allowed to go for a walk, and she should take advantage of it. But there were so many purchases that the question arose of how to carry them all to the carriage. So the girl lingered in the store. Margot witnessed a shop assistant scolding a boy for attempting to steal, but he categorically denied his guilt. Margarita even got scared. It suddenly seemed to her that they were talking to her. Her heart even skipped a beat. It was so familiar to her. At this time, the servant unceremoniously grabbed the guy by the hand and was about to punish him, completely ignoring his excuses. The boy struggled and shouted loudly that he was being accused in vain. He had never even thought of taking anything without asking and paying. Margarita watched what was happening with interest, thinking about how best to intervene and stand up for the boy. At this time, the guy broke free from the hands of the shop worker and ran towards Margarita. What the girl had feared had happened. The boy had crashed into her with all his might, sending both children to the floor with their shopping bags scattered around them. Margarita asked the guy if he was okay, and said that he should watch his step more carefully. Margot looked at the guy's face, and it seemed familiar to her. but she had definitely never met him. He just looked incredibly similar to Marianne Ashford. The resemblance was absolute. Margot immediately realized that this boy was most likely Marianne's son. It was unlikely that he could be her younger brother. He was too young. Margot asked the boy if everything was okay. Maybe he was hurt or something was hurting him. The girl wanted to help the boy get up, but he categorically refused help and got up from the floor on his own. Margarita didn't expect such a sudden refusal to help. The guy was clearly not in the mood for peaceful communication. At first, he accused Margarita of deliberately bumping into him and making him fall, but Margot tried to justify herself. The boy did not listen to her. He turned away and headed for the exit, declaring that he wanted to be left alone. Margarita was taken aback by such rudeness and silently watched as the stranger left the shop. Margosha was absolutely sure that this was Marianne's son. The guy's eyes were exactly like the Duchess of Ashford's. Margot couldn't get it mixed up. Margosha returned to the carriage thoughtfully and sat silently, thinking about what had happened. Ethan asked what had his sister so worried, or if something had happened in that shop, or if she had met someone unpleasant. Margarita asked him why he thought that, and Ethan replied that Margot had looked depressed since they left the store. Margarita said that in the shop, she met a boy who looked like two peas in a pod, with Duchess Marianne Ashford. Ethan asked what had her so worried, or if this guy had managed to offend Margot, in which case it was worth dealing with him. Margarita replied that nothing of the sort had happened, and that Ethan shouldn't worry about it, since if anything happened, Margot could stand up for herself. Margosha yelled at her brother for constantly interfering in her affairs and trying to beat up anyone who came near her. Ethan was offended. He did not deserve the accusations against him. The boy expressed the thought that it was quite possible that they would soon see Marianne's son again. Marianne fell silent. After Ethan's words, the image of that boy appeared in her eyes again. If she met him again, she would try to talk to him normally. Margarita breathed a sigh of relief. The foray into the city had ended without incident, but a new trial awaited them at home. Salvador announced that it was time for his grandchildren to begin rehearsals, and he sent out invitations to the concert to all the aristocrats and members of the royal family. The caring grandfather announced that his grandchildren had a whole week to prepare, and he was sure that was a lot. Ethan and Morticia slept quietly and peacefully. It was early morning, and the DeHart family's offspring were not accustomed to getting up too early. Margarita flew into her cousin's room like a whirlwind and shouted that it was time for them to get up and get to work. Ethan was indignant. Why did they have to get up so early, and what was Margarita doing that made his cousin unable to sleep? Margot reminded her cousins that there was only a week left until the holiday, and she had an important announcement for her brother and sister. But they had to change their clothes quickly. After some time, the children were in the hall, where Margarita set up a board on which she detailed the preparations for the holiday. Margarita demanded that Ethan and Morticia listen without distraction to everything she was about to tell them. Margot announced that she had thought for a long time about what the three of them could perform, and since Morticia couldn't sing, she had settled on a dance number. The children didn't even notice that Grandfather Salvador was watching them from the balcony. He could hear everything his grandchildren were saying. Unexpectedly, the head of the family was joined by Count Bernard Ruby DeHart, his youngest son, and for some time now, Margaret's father. Salvador informed his son that the children had begun preparing for their concert number. Bernard asked if his father had really decided to test this girl's capabilities again. The most amazing thing was that she managed to take care of her cousins. Lord Salvador replied to his son that Margot was successfully overcoming all difficulties, and that watching her growth and achievements gave him great pleasure. Bernard could only agree, but he noted to himself that his father was rarely interested in anything and even more rarely honored anyone with his attention. Salvador and Bernardo watched with interest as the children discussed their upcoming performance. Although it was not really a discussion, Margarita did most of the talking. She was both for the choreographer and for the coach. Morticia and Ethan listened attentively to Margot and remembered everything she said. Salvador's announcement of a special performance by his grandchildren turned a family get-together into a major party. The estate was in a state of organized commotion all week, but everything was ready by the appointed time. Margarita was worried. Everything turned out to be much larger than she expected. They, of course, rehearsed a lot, but still, the jitters did not leave her. Margarita was secretly spying on the preparations for the holiday when suddenly a loud question was heard behind her. "What is she doing here?" Margot looked back, made an innocently perplexed face, and asked who he was and what he was doing here. Count Bernard appreciated the joke and replied that Margot had not yet fallen into senile dementia and should remember him. The girl said she was joking. She was just watching the servants and trying to calm down. Bernard noticed that Margarita simply found an excuse to skip the rehearsal, even though it was practically the last one. The girl noticed that red drops of rubies were sparkling in her father's ears. Margarita recognized the very earrings that she had bought in the store during her last walk, especially for her father, and she was glad that he had worn them tonight. Margot looked incredibly smug, and Bernard didn't immediately understand what had caused the sudden change in his daughter's behavior. A happy Margot said she was glad because her father liked the gift. She spent a long time choosing them and thought they were an incredible match for Bernard's image. The girl unexpectedly declared that she was putting a lot of effort into this performance and deserved a reward. Bernard remarked that it was a rather impertinent request, but if the party went off without incident, he would reward all three with whatever they desired. Margarita took a solemn oath from her father that he would fulfill his promise. For her part, Margot was going to do everything possible to ensure that the performance went brilliantly and that Bernard would have the opportunity to fulfill his vow. Margarita intended to melt this man's icy heart completely and become a real daughter to him. The day of the performance arrived. Margarita was worried and asked the maids to approach the preparations with special care. Unexpectedly, Leah announced that, by order of Lord Salvador, Margarita would be greeting guests today and fulfilling the duties of the head of the family. Margarita didn't expect such a turn of events, but the only good thing is that now the maids will try to do her hair and makeup as best as possible. Margot didn't even think that today she would be put at the head of the reception and would have to greet the guests. But this was a chance to make a good impression on everyone. Accompanied by the head maid, Margarita proceeded to the main entrance of the mansion. A sense of the importance of the moment overwhelmed her. Leah walked ahead of the young lady and was glad that there was a lot of activity in the house. Not long ago, there were no holidays at all, and now there was already a second one in a couple of months. Margarita decided to show everyone how well-mannered and aristocratic she was, and that a great future awaited her. The girl walked through the mansion and was amazed at how much it had been transformed for this evening. An incredible amount of effort and money had been invested in the preparations. Margarita was torn from contemplating the magnificent decoration of the halls and corridors of the DeHart mansion by a familiar voice. It was Mrs. Irene. She was surprised that Margot had come downstairs so early to begin her duties. Bernard joined them. He was glad that his daughter had been entrusted with greeting the DeHart family's guests today. However, judging by Margot's calm expression, she had apparently not yet been brought up to speed on the matter. The girl replied that she did not see anything complicated in it. Bernard hoped that Margarita would try to fulfill her duties properly, and that he would not have to blush for his daughter. Bernard DeHart told his daughter that she should carry herself with dignity, as befits the head of the family. Finally, Margarita realized what a mess she had gotten herself into. She would have to greet all the guests of the evening without exception, standing on a special platform at the entrance. Ethan supported his sister as best he could, and his father was there, but the situation was still stalemate. Margarita realized what it meant to welcome guests in this house. She discovered that they placed much greater hopes on her than she had imagined. Margot would be lying if she said she wasn't nervous, but deep down, she was glad to be entrusted with such an important mission. This meant that she was on the right track, and that it was only a short time before she won a worthy place under the roof of the DeHart house. The majordomo received the order to open the gates and let the guests in. The gates slowly opened, and the guests poured into the mansion in a colorful crowd. The cream of the empire's aristocracy was there, and the girl was at first taken aback by the sight of their luxurious outfits and the glitter of their jewelry. Lord DeHart's family had long led a secluded life. Large-scale receptions had not been held at the mansion for 10 years. Naturally, all those invited showed up for the evening. The aristocrats were burning with impatience to see the mansion of the all-powerful Salvador and his grandchildren. At receptions of this level, everyone wants to look their best. Many guests came with gifts, and Margot had to accept them. The girl tried to be nice. If she managed to make the proper impression on the aristocrats, she would certainly be recognized as the heir of the DeHart family. Margot smiled, held herself straight and with dignity. It was necessary to find words of greeting for each guest. Everyone thanked the girl and looked forward to a special evening. Ethan admired his cousin. She looked magnificent. dignified and polite. She greeted guests, with her whole appearance showing the hospitality and grandeur of this house. The guy was surprised. This was a new role for Margot, but she carried herself well and looked dignified. Ethan assumed that he himself could not have played this role better. Through the endless greetings, Margot heard that the ducal house of Ashford was also among those invited. Some guests were surprised that the Duchess of Ashford was expected to attend the de Hartz's evening party, and they assumed she would be shy and skip the event. But the hesitant guests received a categorical answer. Marianne cannot not come. Lord Salvador personally sent her an invitation. Soon all doubts were dispelled by the Duchess herself, who appeared on the threshold of the de Hart mansion with her son. Margaret did not expect that she would finally be able to see the son of her Grace Lady Marianne. They say that they look very similar. Mariana and her son entered the gate, and Margarita realized that this time all the rumors were true. Marianne was beautiful and asked permission to introduce her son to Margarita. A young aristocrat approached Margot's dais, and the girl recognized the same guy she had encountered in the store a week ago. Margarita greeted the guy and said that she hadn't had time to introduce herself during their last meeting, and that she needed to clear up a misunderstanding. Ethan watched Marianne Ashford's son and cousin with distrust. The boy felt that Margot was being too kind to the stranger. Margot grabbed the guy by the hands and announced that she wanted to be friends with him and hoped that she would succeed. Ethan hoped that Marguerite had greeted the Ashford offspring only out of politeness, as a guest, but it still angered him. At this time, Margot was wondering whether she had done the right thing by expressing her hope for a friendly relationship, or whether she had been hasty. Judging by the stunned expression in the eyes of the Duchess's son, such a rapid rapprochement was unexpected for him. Margarita apologized for taking the boy by the hand and explained her behavior by saying that she was glad to see him. Margot saw that the guy was not very pleased with her friendliness, and she justified her actions by the desire to give him a warm welcome and apologized again. The Duchess was surprised that her son really knew Salvador's granddaughter, and she wondered where they had managed to meet. The young Duke of Ashford denied knowing Margaret. He declared that the young lady had made a mistake, and, together with Rosina, his sister, joined the stream of guests. Margarita was taken aback by the guy's behavior. He seemed even more introverted than all the members of the de Hart family combined. The Duchess felt uncomfortable with her son's cold behavior and smiled encouragingly at Margaret. Lady Irene watched everything that was happening closely. She found this development of relations between her niece Margot and the Duchess's son strange. The guests dispersed throughout the hall, enjoying the evening and pleasant conversation. Margot sat on the chair of the temporary head of the family and reasoned that she had made a mistake, although she so wanted the boy to enjoy the holiday. Margarita couldn't get the Duchess's son out of her head. Salvador approached her and confessed that he had specially summoned the nobles for this evening. The Lord's only goal was to introduce his wonderful granddaughter to high society. But what should he do if the temporary head of the family had a sour face? Salvador asked Margarita to smile and not make her grandfather blush and justify the boring expression on the face of the main person of the evening. Margarita looked at her grandfather and was charmed by him. Today he looked simply gorgeous. With such an appearance, he would not have to blush in front of anyone. As a consolation and encouragement, Salvador brought Margarita a lot of delicious candies. He believed that this was the best way to calm the children. Salvador noticed that his granddaughter was not at all cheerful or so tired from greeting guests. When Margarita looks like this, Grandpa Salvador starts to worry. She has to tell him what is bothering her. Margarita immediately perked up. It can't be. But Grandpa Salvador is worried about her, so he brought a whole bunch of candies. True, if Margot tells him that she is worried about the fact that the Duchess of Ashford's son seems to hate her, and she wants to clarify this, then her grandfather will laugh at her. Margotia thought for a moment, looked away, and answered her grandfather that nothing special had happened. She was just a little tired and lost in thought. At the same time, she decided to ask Salvador if he knew anything about the Duchess of Ashford's children and whether he could tell her. Lord Salvador smiled sadly and said that one could only pity the children of Duchess Marianne. Margarita wanted more details, and she held her breath so as not to interrupt her grandfather. Salvador said that the Duchess of Ashford's children, like their mother, are rejected by society, and those around them avoid them, which makes their lives incredibly difficult. Now it became clear to Margarita why the Duchess's son was frightened by her friendliness and distanced himself from her. It also became clear why this child had such a hunted look. Margot was familiar with it firsthand. This is how people with deeply wounded hearts look. Margarita once looked at the world around her in exactly the same way. Maybe she is so worried about this boy only because she saw a part of her past self in him. Lord Salvador understood his granddaughter's thoughts and state, and suggested that he saw the Duchess's children heading towards Lady Irene's garden. Margarita was embarrassed to ask her grandfather for permission to leave her position as the temporary head of the family. Salvador himself guessed what his granddaughter wanted and said that if she cared about the Duchess's children, then she could go to them. Salvador believed that all it takes is one caring person for others to begin to open their hearts, and this could happen sooner than expected. Margot thanked her grandfather and decided to immediately go to the Duchess's children. The girl decided to take some candy with her as the best way to cheer up the children. Lord Salvador looked after the girl with warmth. She was charming in her desire to help others. Margot's smile and her determination to take a step towards people captivated the Lord. Margot exceeded all his expectations and delighted him with her spontaneity. Margaret ran to Lady Irene's garden, but the Duchess's children were no longer there. Margot didn't understand where they had gone. She had already walked around all the areas adjacent to the garden, but the Duchess's children were not there. Margot was too naive to think that this problem could be easily resolved. Suddenly, the girl heard voices, but they were not children. Margot listened and became indignant. One of the guests speculated that the Duchess of Ashford's children did not show up at the party because they knew everyone disliked them and were probably hiding somewhere. The guest said that these children were the offspring of a witch and as disgusting as their mother. Others confirmed that Ashford's daughter and son huddled so tightly together and looked at everyone with such hostility that it gave everyone goosebumps. Margarita decided to appear right in front of the gossips, which put them in an awkward position. They were even a little scared of Margarita. The girl asked them where they got such confidence in the depravity of the Duchess's unfortunate children. All the children at this party are heirs of noble families, and the title of Duke is much higher than many, so why is everyone looking down on the Ashfords? One of the boys suddenly became bolder and replied that Margot had no right to tell them what to do. She was just a commoner who had been taken into a noble house out of pity. Margarita asked the impudent man if he really thought that her past somehow diminished her status as the temporary head of the Deshart family. The girl asked them what they thought would happen if she reported this to the children's families, and she remembered each one well. Courage immediately left all the offspring of noble families, and they decided to quickly leave this place so as not to arouse Margot's desire to repay them. The Duchess of Ashford's son immediately emerged from behind the tree. The boy accidentally witnessed the entire conversation. Margot realized that the guy had heard everything and asked him for forgiveness for these young gentlemen. Ethan had a strange feeling. The guy loved parties, but today he felt uneasy at this celebration of life. From the moment Margaret took the hand of the Duchess of Ashford's son, Ethan became nervous. The guy was puzzled as to whether Margot had managed to become friends with this pariah while he wasn't looking. Ethan couldn't think of anything better to do than turn to Margarita for help. His cousin is a smart girl and will help him figure out what's going on. And besides, he already misses her. Ethan decided that before the show started, he should find his cousin and find out everything from her. At this time, Margarita was trying to find a way to the heart of the Duchess's son. She didn't even know his name, but she stubbornly tried to improve the relationship. Margot was afraid that her addresses to the guy sounded too familiar, and he was probably used to formal address. The girl explained the guy's intransigence by the fact that there were a lot of people around, and he felt uncomfortable in this hustle and bustle. Margot asked the boy for permission to visit him at the Ashford mansion, if he didn't mind, of course. The guy seemed not to hear Margot. He looked into her eyes and asked why she was doing all this. Margot didn't understand what he was talking about, or what she had done. The guy asked why she had intervened in the conversation of the nobleman's children and stood up for him. The son of Duchess Marianne was sure that communicating with him would not lead to anything good for Margarita. Everyone would turn away from her, and she would become a pariah, like him and his sister. Margosha was delighted. It turned out that all this time he had been avoiding her only because he did not want to harm her. Margarita told the guy that she was pleased with his determination to talk and asked him to give her his hand. She had one thing that would lift his spirits. The girl gave the Duchess's son a whole bunch of candies, hoping that they would please the boy. The boy was really happy and asked why candy. in her opinion, the best way to have fun. Margarita replied that a very wise man had told her that sweets were the best cure for childhood sorrows, and she thought he was absolutely right. The guy was in shock. No one had spoken to him as an equal for a long time, but this girl was increasingly inviting him to communicate. The boy told Margot that he didn't really like sweets and would give these candies to his sister. Besides, he should finally introduce himself. His name was Rogdai. Margosha was pleased to meet Rogdai, but she became worried about where his sister could have disappeared to. Rogdai explained that they had gotten separated while running away from those idiotic noblemen, and she must have hidden somewhere nearby. The guy asked Margarita to help him find his sister. He doesn't know the area at all and is afraid of getting lost himself. Margot immediately agreed to help Rogdai. She was pleased that getting closer to the guy had been successful. At this time, Ethan was looking for Margarita. He could not figure out where she had gone. In the guy's opinion, his cousin should be busy with the affairs of the acting head of the family and not disappearing somewhere in the park. Suddenly, Ethan saw a child in the tree. But how did he manage to climb there? Ethan was scared. There was a little girl sitting in the tree. It seemed she was the daughter of the Duchess of Ashford. The girl hugged a large branch and cried loudly. She could not get back down. People gathered under the tree. Everyone recognized Lady Rosina from the Duchy of Ashford, wondered why she ended up in the tree, but no one took action to save her. No one could figure out what to do, and Ethan decided that if the adults were in doubt, then he definitely couldn't do anything, and he decided to just watch. Margarita appeared on the path, saw Rosina, and screamed loudly that she had found her. Ethan saw with indignation that the son of the Duchess of Ashford was standing next to his cousin again. To his shame, the boy did not remember the name of the Duke's offspring. Rosina saw her brother and cried even louder. Rogdai asked why she climbed there. The boy ordered his sister not to move from the spot and was clearly going to climb a tree to get Rosina. Margot stopped Rogdai, saying that climbing the tree was dangerous and that adults should help, but the boy was convinced that no one cared about them and that he had to do everything himself. Margot wanted to object that Rogdai was wrong, but she heard that everyone was only saying that the Duchess should have looked after her children better. They also criticized that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree and that Rosina is just as strange as her mother. It was all so similar to how Margot was judged when she risked her life to save a small child at the end of her first life. She was reborn into this world and was a lonely little girl for a long time, although now Margot is in a completely different situation. But she will never forget that accident. Margot could have been saved if at least someone wanted to do it. Rosina raised herself up on the branch. Apparently her brother's appearance restored her confidence, and she decided to descend on her own. The girl's feet slipped and she fell down, flapping her arms awkwardly and trying to grab onto something. Rogdai was at a loss. He could only shout his sister's name loudly, but the boy couldn't figure out what to do. Margarita didn't think about anything. She rushed under the tree and tried to catch the girl. Rogdai and Ethan rushed after Margarita, but both were too late. Rosina had already fallen on the girl. The fall turned out to be successful. The little girl escaped with only a slight fright and only quietly sobbed in Margot's arms. Ethan saw Margot gently stroking the baby's head and asking her to be careful. The adults came to their senses and rushed to the children. They asked if they felt any pain anywhere and asked to call a doctor. Rosina held tightly to Margarita's hand and through her tears thanked her savior. Margarita thought it was good that Rosina was safe, but she didn't feel any joy at all. It turns out that if Margot hadn't been the acting head of the Heart House, no one would have lifted a finger to help her. They would have stepped over it and left. Margot decided to make a statement and said that she was very upset by the behavior of the nobles. Many were here before her arrival, but no one tried to help Rosina. It turns out that all those noble and eminent people decided to simply pass by the unfortunate children, and they are not guilty of anything. Margot said that one cannot turn away from children. It is the duty of adults to always come to the aid of children. Rogdai looked at Margarita with admiration. The boy had never met such brave and honest people. Bernard suddenly appeared. He praised his daughter's speech as excellent, but immediately picked her up and carried her off somewhere. Margot asked where he was taking her. Bernard replied that they were going to the doctor. Margot demanded that he let her go. The performance was about to start. Bernard decided not to treat Margot and took her to the doctor. The local doctor decided that the girl had a sprain and she should refrain from putting any weight on her leg. Margarita was completely at a loss, and what should she do now? The girl tried so hard, and many spectators came to see the dance of Lord Salvador's grandchildren. If she was not on stage, the dance simply would not take place. Bernard was disappointed. He thought Margot was a smart child, but as soon as he turned away, she would do something stupid. Margarita saw that her father was angry, but what could she answer him? It seemed that Bernard was angry because she was hurt, which meant that he was worried about her. But this simply could not be. The heartless Bernardo could not worry about the lowly commoner, whom he had given as his own daughter. Bernardo stated that Margarita would under no circumstances go on stage. He would not allow the girl to injure her leg even more. Margarita was pleased to hear that they were worried about her. She tried to convince her father that everything was not so bad, but Bernard categorically forbade her to dance. Margot realized that her father would not give in and asked him to support her other idea. It was time for Lady Margaret to appear on stage, a moment everyone had been waiting for with impatience. They said that Salvador's granddaughter was the epitome of charm and were perplexed. According to the program, all 3 grandchildren were supposed to perform a dance, but only Margarita stood on stage. Ethan was tormented by a feeling of guilt. He shouldn't have left Margot alone. She represented the family and would probably just greet the audience. But Margot was not only going to say a welcoming word. Lord Salvador even provided his granddaughter with an artifact that amplifies sound. And this was an extremely rare thing. Margarita felt awkward in front of the guys with whom she rehearsed. They also dreamed of going on stage. But the situation changed, and Margot decided to sing. Margot was unable to dance, and told Bernard that she was going to sing, but her father was puzzled as to whether she could really do it. The girl calmed the count down. She often sang in the tavern. The guests were delighted and even gave her a little money. Bernard decided that this was a good idea for the given situation. But in order to sing as a threesome, they needed to rehearse, and there was no time. Ethan was unfamiliar with the song that Margot offered to sing, and the girl had already decided to give up the performance. Everyone understood that one of Salvador's grandchildren had to appear in public, and it was decided that Margarita would perform alone. Lord Salvador was worried about his granddaughter, but Margarita was confident that she would succeed. Margarita came on stage and announced that due to changed circumstances, the dance was cancelled and she would sing instead. Margot chose a song written by the people of the Barbados Empire. It was her favorite. This song took people back to their bright past and made everyone happy. Margarita tried not to remember her past life. But sometimes I'm overcome with melancholy. There was nothing good in Margot's life back then. But as soon as she started singing, the most painful memories were enveloped in a haze of nostalgia. Margarita took the first notes. The girl was tormented by the question of whether she would be able to reach the local audience with her singing. The main listener and judge of the girl's singing was Lord Salvador, the very man who was now considered her grandfather. The nobles listened attentively to Margarita's singing and did not throw rotten tomatoes at her, which was already good. Margot finished her performance. She was glad that she had not disgraced herself and sang everything without mistakes. The girl hoped that she had conveyed her feelings correctly. Lady Ethan was the first to come to her senses after Margot's performance. She declared that Margarita had sung wonderfully. The song was beautiful, albeit sad. The audience gave Lady Margarita a standing ovation. No one expected that Salvador's granddaughter was actually so talented. Margarita suddenly discovered that everyone liked her singing, and even Lord Salvador smiled with joy and warmth. Lord Salvador was proud of himself and his granddaughter. This girl was a great asset and should bring benefit to the DeHart family. Margarita wanted to get closer to Grandfather Salvador. She took a few steps, completely forgetting that she had twisted her ankle. Margarita's sore leg prevented her from moving freely, and she flew off the stage. Margarita would certainly have hit herself even harder, and, of course, would have been disgraced in front of the aristocrats of the empire. Luckily for the girl, her grandfather Salvador was next to her. The Lord caught his falling granddaughter in his strong arms, and the situation was saved. Lord Salvador announced to everyone that his granddaughter was tired and needed to rest. Salvador ordered the celebration to end and the guests to go home. There was absolute silence in Margarita's room. By order of Lord Salvador, his granddaughter had to have a good rest. Margarita woke up. She didn't even remember how she got into bed and fell asleep. The ending in her memory was like a blur. The girl looked around. Grandfather Salvador was standing near the window. He asked his granddaughter if she had rested well. Margarita asked why her grandfather was here and whether the holiday was already over. Salvador told Margarita that she was very tired today and he insisted that she rest a little more. Margarita agreed with this demand, but wanted to clarify whether her grandfather liked her performance. Salvador replied that he was pleased and believed that he could not have imagined a better gift. Margarita was glad and truly happy that she was able to please her grandfather and make him happy. Lord Salvador discovered that his granddaughter had fallen asleep again, her sleep now calm and even. The girl had calmed down. Grandfather Salvador carefully adjusted the blanket on his granddaughter. The girl was so much trouble, but her presence in the family brought the old man great joy. Edward appeared at the door and asked if his father had put Margarita to bed again himself. Lord Salvador's youngest son was gloomy and angry, but his father decided to ignore his condition. Salvador told his son that he himself was tired today, and if he wanted to talk, it would be better to put it off until tomorrow. Edward demanded an immediate answer to his question. Lord Salvador actually plans to make this girl his successor. Salvador did not want to answer and tried to leave, but Edward forcibly detained his father. The Lord clarified what Edward meant and what he feared so much. His son had doubts about this. Edward stated that Margaret would never be part of the DeHart family for him. She grew up among ordinary people, and it was still unknown whether she was really Bernard's daughter. The older brother found this girl when she was scrubbing floors in some miserable tavern in the poorest area of the capital. Edward was sure that if his father made this girl the head of the family, he would bring shame on the entire DeHart family. Lord Salvador did not deny his son's words. Margarita had truly become dear to him. Outwardly, the young head of the family was in fact a very old man and felt like an elderly person. Salvador told his youngest son that he only wanted to watch the girl grow up, nothing more, and he considered her his granddaughter. Salvador grabbed his son by the throat with a firm hand and deprived Edward of the ability to move and speak. The Lord reported that Edward's despair raises a legitimate question for Salvador about what the future holds for this girl. Edward didn't expect such actions from the old man. It turned out that his father had openly shown his feelings. At this rate, he could really make Margot his successor. Ethan retreated to a secluded corner of the park, the boy tormented by conflicting emotions. From the very end of the celebration, the guy felt uneasy. Before Margot arrived at the estate, such lavish receptions had never been held there. Iton greeted the aristocrats for the first time and even shed tears in their eyes. But he was unable to show himself as befitted his status. Margarita drew all the attention to herself. Everything would be fine. But all this happened at the instigation of the grandfather, and this worried the boy. Edward was not too pleased when he learned that his father had appointed Margarita as acting head of the house. Ethan saw that his father attached great importance to all these facts, and they disturbed both of them equally. The boy remembered that, from the very beginning, Margarita did not want to stand on stage alone. But in the end, all the attention and all the laurels went to her. Ethan was worried that this could happen in real life, with all of Grandfather Salvador's attention going to Margarita, and the boy himself being content with second-rate roles. Lately, all the attention of Salvador, Irene, and Bernard is focused only on Margarita. The whole world revolves around her. Ethan didn't understand what it was about this little girl that made those around her, including himself, revolve around her. The guy believed that the most worthy person should become the head of the family, but it seemed that Margarita was increasingly ahead of him. This girl is smart, sensible, intelligent. The only thing she is inferior to Ethan in is physical strength, but she successfully compensates for this with resourcefulness. A maid came into Ethan's hiding place, asking the young master for forgiveness for disturbing him, and said that Master Edward was looking for him. Ethan was surprised that his father suddenly remembered his existence and rushed to meet him. Margarita woke up. She felt completely rested. Her strength was restored, and her body demanded movement. The girl was worried that she would have to spend another day in bed. She felt her body becoming weak from lying there for so long. The maids entered the room and asked if the mistress was awake. Margot wished the girls good morning and asked what kind of boxes they had brought. The maids reported that these were all gifts sent, especially for the young lady. Margarita asked who sent all this and why there were so many boxes. And again, the whole room turned into a warehouse. The maids looked at each other and reported that Lady Margot's performance at the celebration left no one indifferent. Gifts for the young singer began arriving at dawn, and now there's no end in sight. Only a portion of what was sent was brought into the room. The aristocrats of the empire expressed their gratitude to the young singer in this way. This is a common situation. Leah ordered that the gifts be delivered to Margarita's room as she unwrapped them, so that the lady could begin sorting the presents. Margarita agreed that this was exactly what she would do now. She was flattered to be the center of attention, but at the same time, it was not entirely comfortable. Before unpacking the gifts, Margarita had breakfast, and only then took on this pleasant but tiring task. The maid brought in a few more boxes and announced that this seemed to be the last batch, and there would be no more gifts today. The flow of gifts seemed endless. Their number did not decrease. And at this rate, Margot would not be able to cope even in 2 days. While unpacking, the girl came across a gift from Rogdi Ashford. The Duchess's son had sent her an impressive box, and Margot became curious about what was in it. A note was attached to the gift. Rogdi thanked Margot for saving his sister and asked for permission to visit her soon to ensure her recovery. All the gifts were red. The guy was similar to his mother in this regard, although the apple didn't fall far from the tree. In any case, Margarita was glad that she and Rogdi had become closer. At that moment, there was a knock at the door, and Margot allowed the person knocking to enter. Bernard entered the room, assessed Margot's well-being, and announced that she looked more cheerful than he expected. Margot asked why Bernard decided to visit her. Her father replied that he wanted to make sure that his daughter was okay, and if everything was good, then he was leaving. Margarita said that Dad shouldn't leave her so quickly. Besides, he didn't come empty-handed, wasn't she right? Bernard thought that Margot was not a timid person and asked the girl to express her wishes. Margarita replied that she dreamed of a family walk by the pond. Bernard could not refuse her this little thing. The sun had risen long ago and was shining brightly in the absolutely cloudless sky. Margarita was delighted. She finally got out into the fresh air. The breeze was light and pleasant. Bernard asked if she was really happy about this. Margot replied that she had been locked up for a long time and was gaining strength, but it was boring. The girl asked her father to put her down on the ground near that pond. Bernard thought that the girl was too excited today and asked her to be more careful. Margarita was delighted with the opportunity to walk barefoot on the soft grass near the water. Finally, Margot broke out of the stuffy room. She was still a child, and lying in bed for a long time was only doing her harm. Margarita recalled with horror how she was forbidden to get up and told that she had to stay in bed for the whole day. Rosina and Rugdai came to visit her and were so sweet. Margot could not get used to the fact that they were worried about her. Bernard watched his daughter closely. He couldn't even imagine how he would justify himself to others if something happened to Margot again. Margarita dipped her feet into the cool water and declared that she would be fine if she stayed in that spot and didn't move. The girl found it strange that Bernard had been acting so overly caring, like a real dad, ever since her performance. Margot pulled herself together, and what was there to complain about? She had tried to get closer to Bernard, and she had succeeded, so she should be happy about that. Be that as it may, they rarely went out anywhere like this, just the two of them. So Margot decided to enjoy the moment as if they were a real family. Bernardo decided to entertain his daughter and tell her a story about a coastal ghost that lives near this pond. It is a restless and mischievous, but harmless spirit who loves to play with little girls. Margot, Bernard said. Margarita wasn't exactly scared. She just felt a little less comfortable and a little scared. Margarita did not consider ghosts, even the kindest and sweetest ones, to be welcome neighbors. Bernard, as luck would have it, decided to go away for a long time and leave Margot alone. The girl asked in vain where he was going. Her father just waved his daughter off and asked her to wait. Margarita was left alone by a large and deep pond, near which a ghost lives. The girl found Bernard's actions to be a rather funny joke. What kind of idiot would leave a child alone right after such stories? Margarita didn't believe in ghosts. Did Bernard really think she would fall for such a childish trick? The girl saw her reflection in the pond and shuddered. She decided that it would be better for her to leave the shore of the pond. Just as she was about to leave, she slipped and fell straight into the clear water. The last person she saw before she fell was her cousin Ethan, standing quietly not far from her. Margarita screamed for Ethan to help her, but the boy had no intention of moving. Margot managed to call for help again and went underwater with her head. Bernard's joke turned out to be fatal. Margarita went deeper and deeper under the water. She couldn't swim. The air left the lungs, water seeped in to take its place. It was painful and cold. Bernard had already returned and saw how Margarita had plunged into the water. He hurried to help her. Despite his haste, Bernard managed to notice that his younger brother and nephew were standing not far away, calmly watching Margarita drown. Bernard wanted to ask his relatives why they were so indifferent, but first he had to help Margarita. The pond was not deep, and the rescue operation for the girl was successful. Margarita spat and asked where her father had gone. Bernard asked Margarita for forgiveness. It was a stupid joke. He didn't expect that everything would end so tragically. Margarita felt that Bernard was shaking all over. It was nervous, and the girl thought that, most likely, this man felt guilty, like his father. Margarita decided that Bernard felt guilty because he took her for a walk despite his injuries, and then the accident on the water. Margarita had no idea that Bernardo was so human, but what made him so angry and tremble was also because of this. The girl tried to console her father. He shouldn't worry about her so much. Nothing serious had happened. Margarita did not know whether there was more sympathy or gratitude in her words, but she sincerely thanked Bernard for saving her and called him father. Margot said these words from the bottom of her heart. She was grateful to this difficult man for his care. Margot suddenly asked if Bernard had seen Ethan at the pond. It seemed to her that the boy was not far away, or that she had imagined it. Margarita remembered that she saw not only Ethan, but also his father, Edward, and both relatives calmly watched her drown. Bernard stated that Margarita simply imagined it. There was no one at the pond except the two of them. He simply decided not to bother his daughter with unnecessary worries. Bernard regretted that his younger brother really hated Margarita so much that he really needed to head the family. Ethan took off and ran, but not towards the pond. He was confused again. The boy quickly moved his legs and passionately wanted to meet someone grown-up and strong so that he could tell him about Margarita. Ethan remembered the strange look on his dad's face and his words about how Salvador always indulged Bernardo just because he was the oldest. Now, Salvador wants Edward to recognize a girl who grew up among commoners as an equal. This will never happen. Ethan saw that since the night of the conversation with his grandfather, his father had not been himself. He constantly looked at Margot so frighteningly that the boy became afraid. Ethan didn't understand what happened at the pond. His father put his hand on his shoulder, and the boy's legs seemed to turn to stone, and then he ran and met Leah. Ethan, out of breath, told the maid that Margarita had fallen into the pond and needed urgent help because the girl couldn't swim and her leg was injured. Ethan shouted that Margarita was in danger and that she needed to be rescued immediately. Unexpectedly for the guy, Uncle Bernard appeared with Margosha in his arms. The girl was unconscious. The uncle ordered his nephew not to be hysterical and to calm down. He saved Margarita, and now everything will be fine. Bernard was interested in one question: why Ethan, when he saw Margarita drowning, did not rush to her aid, but stood calmly on the shore. Bernard had sincerely hoped that this was just a misunderstanding, but now he had no doubts left. The Count told Ethan that he had greatly disappointed him, and that now he could not turn a blind eye to the threat the boy posed to Margot's life. Bernard categorically forbade Ethan to approach Margarita. The most he could do was a fleeting greeting in the hallway. A few days later, Margot had recovered from her latest misadventure, and since nothing was bothering her anymore, she could return to fencing with Ethan. One thing was strange. Her cousin never visited her during the days of her illness. It was unclear what he was so busy with that he completely ignored his younger sister. Just as Margot was thinking about her cousin, he turned the corner and practically collided with her. Margarita was delighted to meet him, but her cousin behaved more than strangely. He muttered something instead of a greeting and was about to leave. Margot didn't notice his intentions and announced that she was just about to go to him and ask him to take her with him to training, since that's where he was going now. Ethan didn't finish listening to what Margot was about to tell him. He silently stepped away from his sister and turned away. Margarita was left to wonder what happened to her beloved brother. Since he didn't tell her anything, Ethan took off running down the corridor away from Margarita, as if she were a leper or a ghost. The girl did not understand why her brother had run away from her. Margot was perplexed and decided to drop in on Martisha and have breakfast with her. Only Margarita knocked in vain on her cousin's room and called her by name. The answer was absolute silence. Margarita decided to look into the room. There really was no one there. Where could Morticia have gone, especially at such an early hour? The baby's bed was made, and the room was in perfect order, something Margot hadn't seen there for a long time. Margarita was about to leave when she suddenly noticed Margosha's drawing thrown on the floor. It depicted 4 people, an adult man, a boy, and a little girl. ready to defend themselves from a fourth person, a girl with blonde hair. The drawing puzzled Margarita before she could figure anything out. She heard familiar footsteps behind her. Bernard called his daughter and asked what she was doing there. Margarita replied that she wanted to visit Morticia, but for some reason, she was not in her chambers. Bernard told Margarita that they needed to talk about very important things. Margot had lived her last days in blissful ignorance and the hope that everything would now be fine. So Bernardo's stern expression puzzled her. Bernard asked his daughter to stay away from Ethan and the rest of the family associated with his brother Edwin. Margot didn't understand why she had to avoid her relatives. Bernard explained that it was all for her safety. Margarita did not understand how Lady Irene, Ethan, and Morticia could harm her. Even Uncle Edward seemed to her a complex, but completely harmless person. Bernard replied that until now she had been able to spend time with Edward's children, as if they were ordinary relatives. But now it was time to face the truth. Edward's children are not only related to Margarita, they are also rivals in the struggle for power. Just as mortal enemies as the brothers, Bernard and Edward, it is inevitable. The leader is always alone, and around him there are only enemies who want him to lose. Bernard told the girl that the head of the family was currently deciding who to pass the title to, and Margarita was included among the contenders and should be ready. Margarita told her father that she was not striving for a title and did not want to be the head of the DeHart family. Why did she need those horns? She hadn't really lived yet. Bernard felt like he had misheard what his daughter had said, and that what she was saying was unreal to him. Margot made her position clear. Regardless of the situation in the house, she wanted to remain on good terms with all members of the DeHart family, as she had been up to that day. Margot considered the current situation to be wrong, and stated that Grandfather Salvador would certainly be upset if he learned about the feud between his children and grandchildren. Bernard expected something like this, and understood that it would be difficult to convince Margot to follow his advice. If she insisted, he would arrange a meeting with her grandfather. Bernard did not postpone the meeting with Lord Salvador for long. They met a couple of hours later over a cup of tea. Salvador asked who came up with the idea of the three brothers. Margot couldn't believe that her father had involved her grandfather in their affairs. She wanted to solve it on her own. Bernard told Salvador and Margot in detail everything that had happened a few days ago at the pond, including the strange behavior of Edward and Ethan. Margarita was indignant. But why didn't her father tell her about this before? She should have known. The girl couldn't understand why Edward and Ethan stood calmly aside while she was drowning. Did they really want her to die? Salvador was upset. He assumed that Edward had completely despaired. He was so eager for power that the Lord simply did not know what to do with him next. Bernard stated that the level of hostility on his brother's part had reached a critical point, and he no longer had the right to turn a blind eye to it. Salvador agreed with this. Grandfather asked Margarita if, after everything that had happened, she still wanted peace in the family. Margot replied that now she wanted everyone to make peace even more, and for precisely the same reason. Salvador agreed with Margot. He didn't want to see his grandchildren feuding the same way his sons had once feuded. It would be too exhausting. Lord Salvador stated that in order to avoid senseless conflicts, he would approve the candidacy of his successor in the very near future. Bernard wondered if his father had finally decided who would become the head of the DeHart family after his retirement. Lord Salvador was determined. He already knew a worthy candidate and would soon inform everyone else about it. Margarita understood perfectly well that her grandfather was not the kind of person who would joke about such things, especially in the current situation. Salvador said that kindness and a desire for reconciliation could not be expected from his sons, so he intended to look a little further into the future. Before naming his successor, Lord Salvador intended to have a serious talk with Edward. The youngest son didn't keep us waiting long and showed up almost immediately when his father called. It felt like he had been ready for a serious conversation for a long time. Lord Salvador reported that he knew from Bernardo about what happened at the pond, how Edward not only did not help Margot himself, but also did not allow Ethan to do so. Count Edward did not deny what had happened, and did not even try to justify himself. Salvador was outraged. Edward really stood and watched as Margarita drowned and did not try to help. He still hoped that Bernard was exaggerating. Is his own son really so cruel and power-hungry that he is ready to sacrifice a family member for the sake of his ambitions? Edward stated honestly and openly that his main wish now was for this girl to simply disappear, or better yet, die. Lord Salvador knew his son Edward was in dire straits, but he never imagined that he could sink to such baseness. Edward acted consciously, and therefore asked his father, when it happened, that their family became subject to empty sentimentality. The DeHarts always fought fiercely for power. Lord Salvador tried to appeal to his son's feelings and his responsibility for the lives of those around him. But Edward was adamant. Count Edward reminded his father that the DeHart family was famous for the fact that everyone was free to be cruel without regard for others, even blood relatives. The Lord regretted that his son reasoned in this way. Salvador stated that Edward never understood the true value of the head of the family. Father was indignant. Even if the man was a genius, Salvador would never hand over the reins of power to someone who did not take into account his close relatives. Lord Salvador reminded his son that he had told him this hundreds of times. First, you need to learn to be a man, and then strive for power. The Lord declared that his position was unchanged, and he would not hand over the house of DeHart to the hands of such as his Edward, men without hearts, in whom there was not a drop of compassion. Salvador said that if Edward so strongly desired to take the place of the head of the family, he should achieve recognition in a fair fight, and not plot against Margarita. Count Edward was indignant. Did his father really think that he would so easily give up power to some girl? Lord Salvador confirmed that this is exactly what he believes. Count Edward DeHart will never defeat Margaret DeHart, no matter how hard he tries. Edward was furious about the conversation with his father and rushed to look for Ethan. The boy spent time in his room. Lately, he did not feel like doing anything. Edward burst into his son's room and slammed the front door so hard that even the strong walls of the mansion shook. Ethan was shocked by such abrupt behavior of his usually level-headed father and asked him what had happened and why he was so angry and worried. Edward's answer left the boy in a state of shock. Was his whole life really going to go down the drain just because his father wanted it that way? The Count was adamant that he would not turn a blind eye to this girl's antics. Edward insisted that Ethan should consider Margarita his main enemy. Edward squeezed his son's shoulder painfully and demanded that he swear that he would fight Margarita. The Count declared that he would never hand over the title of head of the House of DeHart to some upstart who had grown up among the commoners. Ethan tried to explain to his father that he could not consider Margarita an enemy. She had become his family. The boy said that they were like brother and sister, and Margarita never showed hostility towards him. Edward was indignant that his son did not understand that when he was stripped of his title and sent into exile, it would be too late to shed tears. Ethan firmly stated that he was not going to hurt his family. If he followed his father, it would hurt everyone. It so happened that this conversation between Ethan and Edward was overheard by Margarita, who happened to be passing by her brother's room. The girl felt better. Ethan had doubts because of his father's prejudices, but remained true to his kind heart. Margot decided that she had to find a way to reconcile everyone. A little later, Margaret was supposed to meet Lady Marianne, who was waiting for her at her usual place in the garden of the DeHart mansion. Margot was late. She asked for forgiveness, but Marianne was not angry with her and suggested that they start serving before the tea got cold. Marianne noticed that Margarita looked worried and asked what had happened to her. The Duchess noted that staying at the DeHart mansion has recently felt oppressive. Margarita wondered if she could trust Lady Marianne. In fact, she had been kind to the girl lately, and Lord Salvador trusted her. Margot decided to take a risk and trust the Duchess of Ashford. The girl told her what was really going on in the DeHart mansion. Marianne thought about it. It turned out that both the incident at the pond and the fact that Margot and Ethan had become estranged from each other were all consequences of the struggle for the place of the Lord's successor. Mariana suggested a simple way to solve this problem. Margarita should simply move in with her. The Duchess was delighted with her idea. If Margot moved in with her, she would no longer have to worry about anything. She would not have to expose herself to danger. If Margot needed a reason to leave the Lord's house, then Marianne could arrange her engagement to Rajday. Margarita decided that this was too abrupt. Margot was grateful to the Duchess for her sympathy. If she could leave the DeHart mansion, she would actually feel better. Everything was complicated by Margot's stubborn nature. She did not want to run away and did not want to hide from problems. The girl told the Duchess that she was going to stay in the house of Lord Salvador DeHart and do everything to ensure that peace and quiet reigned in this family. Mariana asked why Margarita was so determined. What was stopping her from leaving this uncomfortable family and living her own happy life? Margot replied that she had fought for her grandfather's recognition for so long that now she simply felt sorry to give up everything. She believed that this time, too, she would be able to change everything herself. Margarita believed that escape did not suit her. If battle was inevitable, she would accept the fight and fight bravely. Marianne admired the girl. Her decision to stay and fight was entirely in her spirit. The Duchess promised to provide the girl with every possible support. Whether by chance or not, Lord Salvador heard the entire conversation between Marianne and Margarita. His granddaughter did not disappoint the old man's expectations. Now it was the turn of the head of the family. If his granddaughter showed such determination, then he too could not back down. There was not much time left to wait. The day was approaching when the fate of the House of DeHart would be decided once and for all. One ordinary day, when the maids were still busy with Margarita's morning toilet, there was a loud knock on the door of her room. The girl was not expecting anyone so early, and could not even imagine who it could be. Margarita interrupted the process of creating a hairstyle and allowed entry. Lily burst into the room, incredibly excited and out of breath from running so fast. Margarita asked what happened, and why Lily looked out of sorts. The maid announced that an urgent message had arrived from Lord Salvador. An important announcement was being prepared regarding the successor to the post of head of the family. All members of the DeHart family are required to report to the Central Garden immediately. The same message was sent to Margaret's father, Count Bernard, and of course to Count Edward, his son Ethan, and daughter Marticia. Lord Salvador DeHart looked impeccable, young, handsome, fit. His appearance did not match his age. Only the look in his cold eyes betrayed experience and intelligence. The head of the family glanced at his children and household members. It seemed that everyone was gathered. Lord Salvador announced that he had gathered everyone here for an important matter, and here and now he was announcing the beginning of the official trial that would determine his successor. Wow, Margarita thought. Grandpa is just on fire. What interesting tasks he came up with for the test subjects. Salvador said that he had hoped to resolve the issue of succession peacefully, but the heirs themselves were starting to fight, and he could no longer turn a blind eye to this. Lord Salvador caught the anxious look of his youngest son and declared that two contenders, Ethan and Margarita, would face off in the fight for the title of successor to the head of the family. The fathers of these two children, Eduardo and Bernardo, are prohibited from any participation in the competition beyond simply assisting the participants. Salvador announced an important condition. If anyone died or was seriously injured during the test, both candidates would be deprived of the right to inherit. In addition, the grandfather noted, the candidate who lost the competition would be sent to a country estate for a while. Margarita was indignant. Sending a man to a country estate meant, in fact, expelling him from the DeHart mansion, and that was also impossible. Of course, the losing contender has absolutely nothing to worry about, Salvador continued. This does not mean at all that he will cease to be a member of the family. The Lord only wanted the losing contender to devote himself to improvement, grow stronger, and then return to the bosom of his native family. Ethan agreed to the conditions. If the fight was fair and honorable, he would give it his all and try to defeat his sister. It was strange, Margarita thought. Ethan looked much better, as if his grandfather's announcement had cheered the boy up. Ethan's eyes lit up, and he was finally able to look straight into Margarita's eyes. Margot had some doubts, but she also agreed to participate in the duel. Lord Salvador was pleased that both his grandsons agreed to participate in the competition for the right to be considered the successor to the head of the family. The test was designed to reveal the quality that the DeHart family valued most: excellence in any field. Edward clarified that all that would be required was for Lord Salvador to recognize the applicant's skills in any field of activity. The Lord objected that it would not be him who would decide who would win the competition. An independent judge would evaluate the skills of the contenders. After much hesitation, Salvador decided that this person would be the head maid of the mansion, Madame Liana. Edward was indignant. His father was proposing that the future of the most influential and noble family in the empire be decided by ordinary servants. Salvador objected. Madame Liana could hardly be considered an ordinary servant. She looked after the children, who embodied the future of this house, more closely than anyone else. Therefore, Lord Salvador believed that no one could handle the choice of the future head of the family better than this woman. Ethan and Margarita must, at any cost, gain the recognition of the head maid and prove that they are worthy of leading the DeHart family. The time frame given for everything was not too long, but not too short either. Salvador determined that the results of the competition would be announced in a week. Edward was overconfident. He considered this test simple. His son would undoubtedly be the winner. Count Edward decided that Ethan's schedule could remain unchanged. The boy should spend the entire week honing his sword-fighting skills. Edward was confident that Ethan's skill with the blade would prove that he had the potential to become a reliable support and protector for the DeHart family. The Count instructed his son to earn the right to power and show everyone his true power. Bernard and Margarita were not so sure. They remained alone on a bench in the central garden and became lost in thought. Margot thought she needed to figure out what would make Liana believe she was worthy of leading the DeHart family. Margarita was indignant that for such an important task, her grandfather had given her only 1 week, which could have been accomplished in a miserable 7 days. Bernardo advised his daughter to think everything over carefully. The main thing is to figure out what kind of person the headmaid is and what she might like. Margarita thought about what Liana was like. She seemed to be diligent, honest, kind. That was all the girl could say about her. It turned out that Margot knew nothing about the person who was next to her most of the day and made her life comfortable and easy. What is she really like? This still young woman in a strict uniform dress and cap. What worries her? What she thinks about? What she loves? Margarita realized that she knew Liana only from one side, as a person who constantly takes care of her. It never occurred to the girl to inquire about Liana's past or her life outside the mansion. The headmaid's dreams and thoughts did not concern Margarita. Liana was always nearby, leaving and coming at the first call, but no one thought of her as a person. Margarita concluded that her grandfather was hinting, or rather saying outright, that his grandchildren needed to rethink some things in this life. Bernard sat silently next to her and waited for his daughter to decide. The girl suddenly perked up, as if she had come to some important decision. Margarita asked her father to arrange for a carriage to be prepared for her. Margarita decided to enlist the support of those around her. Only then will she find a way to win this duel. Bernard realized that Margarita had an idea and said that he would order everything she wanted to be prepared for her immediately. Not much time had passed, and Margarita had already left the estate. Bernard was almost certain that his daughter's wits would not fail him this time either. Margarita was starting on the path to victory or defeat. It was a matter of luck, the girl reasoned. Margot had never doubted herself before, but at the crucial moment, she was always overcome with anxiety. Margot had made up her mind. She needed to enlist the support of those around her and use their power wisely. This was certainly one of the key qualities required of the head of the family. Lady Irene suddenly appeared in the hall and asked where Lady Margaret was, but was told that the young lady had left on business. Irene had long kept a low profile, but now that the fight for Lord Salvador's inheritance was in full swing, she couldn't let her guard down. Margarita hurried to the Duchess of Ashford's mansion. Marianne was experienced in many areas of life and promised the girl her help. Margot got out of the carriage. The carriages were tiring, cars in her past life were a different matter, but use what is at hand and don't look for something else. I wonder where it came from. The mistress of the estate told Margot that the girl could come here at any time, so she showed up uninvited, and doubts arose again that maybe it was all in vain. Even if the Duchess is favorably disposed towards Margaret, she may burden her with her sudden visit. The doubts were in vain. Marianne was delighted with Margarita's arrival, as if she were her own daughter. The Duchess asked with concern about the difficulties of the journey and Margot's health, and the girl replied that she was doing well. The girl thanked the Duchess for the warm welcome and for meeting her personally. Marianne replied that it was not worth thanking. She did what she had to, since Lady Margaret herself had come to visit her. The exchange of pleasantries was interrupted by the appearance of the daughter and son of the Duchess of Ashford. Rosina and Rogdai, without observing any formalities, rushed towards Margarita. Rosina hung on the girl's neck with a loud, joyful cry. Margarita was glad to meet her friends. They hadn't seen each other for so long that they had time to miss each other. Margarita couldn't believe that the Ashford family had given her such a warm welcome. It even brought tears to the girl's eyes. Mariana sat Margarita down at the table and asked what brought the girl to them today. Finally, Margarita could tell what worried her more than anything else. Margarita reported that her grandfather had started a competition to determine the future successor. Marianne was surprised. Lord Salvador had long spoken about the possibility of such a competition, but had only dared to announce it now. Margarita said that she only had a week to do everything, during which time she needed to get approval from the head maid, Liana. Margot was completely confused, so she came to ask Lady Marianne for advice. The Duchess wondered if Margaret was being overly concerned about what her grandfather had called a test. It's hard to suddenly appear in a different light, especially when you only have a week to spare. So Margarita just needs to be herself and do things her way. The girl was amazed by such a simple conclusion. How to do it your own way. It was strange to listen to such advice. Mariana advised the girl to remember how exactly she became friends with her, and then with her son and daughter. Even when Marianne kidnapped the girl, she did not bow to either fear or force, and later declared that she believed her, just like her grandfather. Even in that incredible situation, Margot listened to Marianne, and was the first to extend a helping hand, offering to make peace. Marianne was confident that compassion and kindness were Margarita's most powerful weapons, and that by using these qualities, she would achieve victory. Mariana asked to share with her what kind of head of the family Margarita wants to become. Margot agreed with the Duchess. She could not compare to Ethan in strength and fighting ability, but she wants to become the kind of head of the family who will warmly care for everyone and will always be there to support in any trouble and help with any problem. Mariana and Rogdai listened attentively to Margarita and admired her words. In her past life, Margarita was alone, and there was no one to take care of her. In this life, Margarita was able to come this far, only thanks to the support of all her friends. Having received so much love, now she wanted to repay them in kind. Margarita decided that as a result of this test, she intended to give Liana exactly what she needed most. The Duchess agreed with Margarita. A wonderful idea came to her mind. Rugdai agreed with his mother. Margarita was delighted. She couldn't believe that such a kind and charming person would become her son's bride. Rogdai and Margot were shocked by such a statement. Rogdai suggested to the girl that it would be better if she achieved Liana's recognition in her own unique way. The boy didn't know if his hint would help Margot. He had recently seen Liana in the city. Margarita listened for a long time to the thoughts of Rogdai and his mother. They gave the girl many good advice. Margot agreed with much, rejected some, and as a result of a joint brainstorming session, a brilliant plan was developed. Now, Margarita knew what to do and was grateful to the Duchess and her son for their advice. Mariana was happy for Margarita and said that they would worry about her and asked to keep her informed of events. Margot was grateful for the support, but the Ashfords felt their efforts were not worth the effort. At this time, Lady Irene decided to become more active in the fight for a place in the sun. Irene informed her patron that if Lady Margaret had not caught Lord Salvador's eye, she would not have had to resort to extreme measures. The woman was concerned about the future of her children and was ready to do anything for their happiness. Irene was sad, but consoled herself that she was doing everything only for Ethan. Count Edward supported and inspired Irene, and he was also ready to do everything for his son. That is why Irene should not blame herself too much. Their sins are justified by a higher purpose. Besides, Edward reminded the woman, she had come up with this plan herself, and over time, Morticia and Ethan would surely understand their parents and approve of their actions. Irene was worried. She sighed and wished that everything would happen exactly this way. Now she needed to finish writing the letter and send it to the Emperor. Ethan continued to practice diligently with his sword. His opponent today were two straw men. The boy handled the sword deftly. The blade, although wooden, seemed to be attached to his hands and moved like a natural extension of his body. The scarecrows were blown to smithereens in an instant. Ethan's blows were precise and lightning fast. The guy was happy with his success. It wasn't for nothing that he had been sweating on the training grounds for the last few years. Margarita watched her cousin. His skill was incredible, and few could surpass this guy now. Margot saw that Ethan was fluent in the sword's aura, which meant that she hadn't imagined it. Ethan had made such incredible progress on his own. In the original novel, Ethan only achieved mastery of the sword's aura at the age of 15. Margarita closely watched her brother's exercises. He tried so hard that one could envy his persistence. The girl decided that she needed to take the competition seriously and give it her all. The maid clarified that the young lady was planning to go somewhere today as well, and Margarita confirmed her guess. Margot was going to carry out Grandpa Salvador's mission, and that said it all. The maid asked what Lady Margaret had planned, but the girl decided to keep it a secret until the very last day. The maid grumbled. Lately, Margot keeps disappearing somewhere and then returning covered in dirt. It's unclear what she's doing in this garden. The head maid said that, although this was Lord Salvador's test, she was very worried about Margot, but Ethan was always in sight, and it wasn't so scary. Margarita asked Liana to be patient for a little while. Things were difficult for everyone right now, but this would help them become a close-knit and loving family. The maid wanted to say something else to Margarita, but the girl was terribly busy. Liana wished the young lady good luck, and Margarita took off at full speed. Liana felt someone standing behind her and looked back sharply. It was Messrs. Salvador and Bernardo. They suddenly appeared near Margarita's room and heard her talking about a close-knit and loving family. Lord Salvador didn't know what his granddaughter was up to, but she was clearly moving in the right direction. Bernardo was confident that this time too, Margarita had managed to find her way and would undoubtedly amaze everyone with the originality of her idea and execution. Bernardo believed in his girl more than anyone else, strangely enough. But with her appearance, he himself began to change for the better. Margaret was in a hurry. She hoped that she could bring happiness and peace back to this wonderful house. The girl arrived in the city. All her affairs were connected only with the test, and here she solved the same problems. Margaret didn't take any escorts with her. They only slowed her movements down. Recently, no one had dared to harm Lord Salvador's granddaughter. Sir Gunther appeared. It was he whom Margarita was expecting. She was glad to meet her old friend. Gunther decided that life in the mansion was good for the girl. She looked better every day. Margot was pleased with the praise. But what about her request? Gunther handed the girl a large wooden box, in which something was rattling, and said that this was all that had been done for today. Margarita was grateful to Gunther that he had put so much effort into getting it, and at such a huge profit. Gunther sometimes didn't understand aristocrats. For some reason, Margot wanted to risk everything she had and fight Ethan one-on-one. Gunther didn't believe that Margarita could really defeat the scion of the Count's family with something like that. It wasn't that Gunther was Ethan's mentor, it was just that the boy was truly incredibly talented and would one day be among the best swordsmen in the Empire. Margarita received further confirmation that she was right. Sir Gunther also considered Ethan a worthy opponent. Margarita replied that she had no doubt about Ethan's merits, and therefore decided to use an original approach in this competition. The girl reminded Gunther that he had said that there was always a chance to win, even if it was tiny. Gunther approved of Margarita's attitude. She must have planned something incredible. He decided that he would root for her. When asked why not Ethan, Gunther replied that, of course, he needed to support his own student, but he needed Margot to defeat the scoundrel Edward. As he escorted the girl to the carriage, Gunther wished her to give it her all, but not to overdo it. It is always necessary to have at least a little strength left in reserve for the next victory, the experienced fighter advised Margarita. Margarita replied that Sir Gunther should take care of himself and not strain himself too much at work. The cunning shopkeeper shouted after the carriage so that in case of victory, Margarita would remember who helped her achieve this. The week of preparation flew by in the blink of an eye. Ethan diligently practicing with the sword. Margarita ran around everywhere with building materials, surprising everyone around her. Ethan believed that no one could surpass him in skill, and that he would win. Margarita was less confident of victory, but hoped for a successful completion of her hopeless cause. Ethan hid his thoughts, but in reality, he was preparing with all his might, just so that Margarita would never have to be ashamed of him. Margot recognized Ethan's abilities, but she wasn't going to lose without a fight. The day of the long-awaited duel between the two best offspring of the DeHart family has finally arrived. A day that will decide everything and put an end to all the eyes in the sentences. The mansion was buzzing like a disturbed beehive in the morning. Everyone was discussing the chances of the contenders to succeed the head of the family. Margarita and Ethan appeared before strict judges, and the children wore their formal costumes for the occasion. Lord Salvador decided to give an opening speech. It was not long, but capacious. Today, Salvador announced, would determine who would become his rightful heir, and who should take second place and become the heir's assistant. Madame Liana was worried about both of them. Both Margarita and Ethan were equally dear to her, but the children had to demonstrate their abilities to the fullest extent. The whole family gathered to witness the triumph of one child and the defeat of another. Everyone understood that the guys had little time to prepare, but both were in equal conditions. Madame Liana believed that both Marguerite and Ethan had done their best in the 7 days allotted to them. Lord Salvador's face is inscrutable, making it impossible to tell which of the participants he sympathizes with. Brothers Edward and Bernard, like their father, stood with stony faces. But here, no need to guess. Each was rooting for his own child. Lady Irene took the most inconspicuous place, behind the servants. But she was the ace in the hole that Edward was counting on in case of Ethan's loss. Margarita and Ethan had been preparing diligently for this day and were eagerly awaiting the start of the trials. The children were ready to show everything they could achieve in a short period of time. Lord Salvador gave the go-ahead for the competition to begin and asked his grandchildren to show their best. It was decided that Ethan would go first. The women were supposed to go first, but it was decided by lot. Edward wished his son to demonstrate all his skills to the maximum, and the boy was ready for the performance. Ethan stepped to the center of the court and stated that all this time he had been perfecting his abilities in order to protect the DeHart family. Everyone was stunned by Ethan's abilities. He wielded a sword like a little god, and it was especially striking that the boy, at such a young age, had mastered a special technique, the sword's aura. Liana watched the young master indifferently. He was an excellent swordsman, but was that enough to rule the family? Ethan continued to demonstrate his skill. The sword in the boy's hands seemed like an extension of his arm. The boy was preparing to demonstrate his incredible ability to enhance the force of his sword strike. One of the trees standing next to the site was chosen as the object of the demonstration. Ethan swung his sword and struck the tree trunk. The eyes of those present became like saucers. There was truly something to be surprised about here. An 11-year-old boy, almost a child, cut through a tree trunk more than half a meter thick with one blow of his sword. The young swordsman stopped next to a fallen tree. No beads of sweat were visible on his face, and his breathing was even, as if he had not been swinging his sword. There was thunderous applause, and Edward smiled smugly. Could any girl possibly surpass his son's skill? Madame Liana acknowledged that Ethan DeHart was an unrivaled swordsman. Ethan mastered such a powerful technique as sword aura in such a short time. It was simply incredible. Lord Salvador agreed that in the entire empire, there were no people equal to Ethan in the art of sword fighting, plus a huge progress, and this in just a week. It was Lady Margaret's turn to show off her achievements. Madame Liana asked the girl not to worry, and to show everyone what she had prepared. Margarita announced that very soon, she would demonstrate everything that she had prepared for today. But first of all, Margarita wanted to get permission from everyone present for one minor action. Madame Liana clarified what exactly they should allow Margarita. First, they need to find out specifically, and only then allow it or not. Margarita said that she was asking permission for Madame Liana to go with her to a certain place. The girl only wanted Liana and everyone else to agree to this. A week ago, Rugdai gave Margarita a great idea, telling her where and how he saw the headmaid in the city. Rugdai did not immediately recognize the woman who was asking about flowers in one of the market stalls. The guy took a closer look and realized that this was the headmaid of the DeHart family. He couldn't be mistaken. Rugdai heard that Madame Liana was interested in a garden plant called Nemesia, which was very popular and grew well. Liana looked at the flowering plants with genuine interest, lingering on the especially beautiful and rare ones. The shop owner asked Liana whether, judging by how often the lady came here, she was very interested in plants. Madame Liana admitted that this was true, but she did not even have a small corner where she could grow flowers. Margarita took Liana to a not-too-remote corner of the park and showed her a small area equipped for relaxation and decorated with various flowers. Liana admired the beauty of this area, but she couldn't understand what it was all about and how it related to today's competition. Margarita reported that this is a new recreation garden. It appeared in the Count's Park quite recently and was created through the joint efforts of many people, including Margot. The girl explained that Lady Irene had once shown her a garden she had created with her own hands, and Margot decided to create something similar. The girl announced that she had arranged this corner especially for Madame Liana, so that she, who was always busy with housework, could rest here peacefully. Liana asked why Margot decided to do this. The girl replied that when she was given her own office, she was incredibly happy. Margarita knew very well how pleasant it was when someone appreciated your efforts and remembered your needs, so she wanted Liana to feel the same joy. The girl admitted that the idea was born thanks to a duel, but she wants Liana, who always works for the good of the DeHart family, to experience true happiness. Liana froze. her throat constricted by tears that appeared out of nowhere. The head maid had never expected this from her masters. Lord Salvador smiled quietly. He liked Margarita's actions, but what would Madame Liana say about this? Ethan knew he seemed to have lost this competition to see who could resist such a gift. Madame Liana overcame her excitement and solemnly declared that such a sensitive soul as Margarita's could be safely entrusted with the future of the de Hart family. The head maid's verdict surprised Margarita. She had hoped for victory, but was not convinced of it. Madame Liana decided that she would give her vote to Lady Margarita. She was worthy of the position of successor to the head of the family. The Lord was glad that a solution had been found. A man who values family loyalty and does not take it for granted, who takes care of the servants, could become the head of the family. Irene and Ethan had already realized that victory had gone to another branch of the de Hart family. Lord Salvador solemnly announced that he, as the current head of the de Hart family, named Margarita de Hart, daughter of Count Bernardo, as his successor. Margarita only now realized that she had achieved not just a place in the sun in this family, but had occupied the highest position imaginable. Lord Salvador planned to immediately break the news to the noble families supporting the de Hart family. Lord Salvador informed all those present that the official appointment ceremony would take place in the very near future. Edward and Irene stood in sad silence. Now they would have to resort to extreme measures. Lord Salvador declared that his decision was final and not subject to appeal, and Madame Liana rushed to congratulate the young lady on her victory. The other maid girls also joined in congratulating the head maid. Count Edward looked at everything that was happening with indignation. His son was pushed away from his coveted position. Ethan approached Margarita and asked the maid girls to let him in. Margarita looked intently at her cousin and waited for what he would say. His words could determine the future of the family. Ethan recognized the solemnity of the moment and addressed his sister formally. The little knight extended his hand to his cousin and gently shook her small, delicate palm. The guy congratulated his sister. Now Lady Margaret is the official heir to the title of head of the de Hart family. It was a historic moment. The loser of the competition extended his hand to the winner and fully acknowledged his supremacy over himself. Margarita and Ethan sealed their partnership with a firm handshake, and now they are no longer rivals, but one happy family. The girls sincerely thanked Ethan for his congratulations. Now they will create their family history themselves. A strange thought flashed through Ethan's head at that moment. He suddenly regretted that Margarita was his cousin. A girl like that could have become his life partner. Several days passed. Lord Salvador announced to the public about Margot's victory. The girl received congratulatory letters from all over the empire. The estate was once again in the throes of organized chaos as preparations for the official ceremony began. There was a fly in the ointment, too. Ethan was preparing to leave for a remote estate. Margarita did not want to part with her brother at all, but this could not mark his departure, and the preparations went on as usual. Margot wondered how mature and handsome Ethan would appear before her the next time they met. Of course, a lot will change in this boy by that time. If only he had the same brave and loving heart as now, Margarita prayed. The events of the last few days brought back memories for Margot of the day she first stepped through the doors of this house. At that time, Margarita was young, inexperienced, and looked at the world with distrust. Suddenly, Count Bernardo de Hart appeared in the life of a poor servant of a rundown tavern. As a result, Margarita ended up at the estate, where many interesting things happened to her. No one could have imagined when Margarita first appeared here that she would not only receive universal recognition, but also become the successor to the head of the family. Margarita's thoughts were interrupted by her father's voice. He looked strange, wearing a black suit and a white bouquet in his hands. Bernard assumed that Margot was currently busy preparing for the ceremony, but asked to give him a little time. Margot was free and agreed. The girl noticed the bouquet and asked who it was for, if it was really for her. Bernard replied that today he wanted to give this bouquet to someone else, but asked Margarita to go with him. Margarita followed her father. They didn't have to go far. There was a family cemetery on the estate's grounds, and that's where they came. Count Bernard stopped at a modest obelisk with a laconic inscription and fell silent for a long time. Margarita looked at the inscription and guessed that this was the grave of Count Bernardo's recently deceased son. The Count confirmed the girl's guess. Here lay Bernardo's only son, the very one whose death had forced him to search for his illegitimate daughter. Margot remembered Bernardo's story when they first met and sighed heavily. She could have had another brother, but fate had treated him cruelly. Bernardo admitted that he was blinded by the thirst for power, and even the death of his son did not touch the heart of the Count, and he convinced himself that it meant nothing. As time went by, Bernardo realized what a fool he had been, and the meaning of his father's words became clear to him. Lord Salvador said that Bernardo had no humanity at all, and even if he became the next leader, he would never make a good ruler. Anyone who is unable to value their own child will never be able to properly govern entire lands and peoples. Margot replied that everyone makes mistakes, whether due to inexperience or stupidity, but the main thing is to find the strength to move on and become better. The girl asked her father not to be sad. She was sure that her brother would want to see his father happy, and suggested coming to her brother's grave together. The ceremony to proclaim the successor to the head of the DeHart family was declared open. Lord Salvador again took the floor to offer his greetings, saying that Margarita was embarking on a new path, and it would certainly not be easy. Grandfather guaranteed Margarita many harsh trials, both for her and for her comrades. Salvador said that the burden of obligations would now become Margarita's constant companion, and moments of grief and pain awaited her. But Margarita has the strength that will help her pass through the fog of the unknown. Salvador believed that Margarita had enough willpower to withstand the adversity that could befall the family, and her sincerity would help her. Lord Salvador believed that Margarita could cope as the current head, and asked if she was ready to fulfill the responsibilities that came with being the head of the family. The girl replied that she believed in a wonderful future in which she was destined to walk hand in hand with her precious family. Margarita vowed never to betray the interests of her family and to put them above her own. In that case, Lord Salvador declared, he named Margaret the official successor and next head of the House of DeHart. Margarita stated that no matter what difficulties and hardships await her ahead, if all these people are nearby, then she will easily cope with everything. The ceremony of appointing the successor and the celebration held in honor of this event were long remembered in the Empire as the most striking event in recent years. The holiday euphoria subsided, and Margarita plunged into everyday affairs and concerns, which now became much more numerous. Margarita has to juggle her studies and get to grips with running a family. So today, she was told that the meeting would start early.